The grand hall of the Moonstone Kingdom was a tapestry of whispered ambition. Starlight filtered through the vaulted stained-glass windows, casting pools of indigo and pearl upon the polished obsidian floor. The air was thick, heavy, with the scent of night-blooming roses and the intoxicating perfume of 100 hopeful hearts. They were the realm's most dazzling jewels, daughters of alphas, warriors with tales etched in scar and sinew, enchantresses with constellations in their gaze. Each had been sculpted for this single defining moment, the royal selection, where the Alpha King would choose his Luna, his queen, his fated equal. And at the head of this magnificent assembly, a statue carved from shadow and resolve, stood Alpha King Darius. His power was not a mere title, it was a physical law, a pressure in the air that made the candle flames bow. He was legend given breath. His wolf, a creature of silent fury, known only in fireside tales, was a testament to a strength that had forged a kingdom from chaos. Yet for all his undeniable might, a hollow ache had taken root in his chest, a void that years of rule and relentless battle had failed to fill. The moon goddess had promised him a mate, a soul crafted to be his mirror, but as season turned to barren season, that divine promise had begun to feel like the cruelest of taunts. His gaze, the color of a winter storm, swept over the procession of noble women. Lady Isolde, with hair like liquid silver and a smile sharp enough to cut diamond, presented her impeccable lineage and razor-sharp intellect. Behind her, Lady Rhiannon of the Ironwood clan stood with the unyielding posture of a born warlord, her emerald eyes holding the strategic fire of 100 conquered fields. And then there was Lady Elowen, whose very presence was said to soothe fevered brows, her aura a gentle balm. They were perfection, incarnate. They were everything a king should desire. And his wolf felt nothing. It was a deafening silence within the sanctuary of his own soul. Each graceful curtsy, each meticulously rehearsed vow of loyalty was met with a vast and echoing emptiness. The ceremony was a beautifully orchestrated illusion, and he was the solitary player who knew the script was false. His beta, Tauren, stood a respectful pace behind him, a steady, silent pillar in the growing sea of his king's disillusionment. Darius's jaw tightened, a subtle, betraying tension. Where was she, the one whose name was written beside his in the stars? The silence from his wolf was not peaceful, it was a roar of profound frustration. It was then, as Lady Isolde's polished words still hung in the perfumed air, that the massive rune-carved doors at the hall's far end groaned in protest. The sound was a violation, a discordant note in the carefully composed symphony. Every head turned as one. The whispers died, smothered by a stunned, icy silence that swallowed the hall whole. A figure stood silhouetted against the torchlight of the outer corridor, small and utterly out of place. She was drowning in a simple, faded servant's dress of muted brown, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and hem. Her head was bowed, a veil of unruly, honey-colored hair concealing her face. In her hands, she clutched a forgotten tray of empty silver goblets, her knuckles white with strain. It was Sera, a scullery maid from the palace kitchens, an omega, the lowest of the low. A wave of confused muttering rippled through the gathered nobility, quickly hardening into disdain. A few nobles sneered, their lips curling. Lady Isolde's perfect practice smile twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated contempt. What was this stain, this blemish on their gleaming perfection doing here? How dare she intrude? But Darius did not see a stain. The moment her small form crossed the sacred threshold, his entire world shifted on its axis. The air crackled, charged with a current he had never before encountered, a static that raised the hair on his arms. The hollow ache in his chest erupted into a sudden searing heat, as if a star had been born behind his ribs. His wolf, silent and distant for so long, did not just stir. It exploded to life. A primal, possessive roar of recognition thundered in the confines of his mind, so powerful, so visceral, it nearly drove him to his knees. Mate. The word was not a thought. It was a law. It was truth etched into the very marrow of his bones. His storm cloud eyes, cold and detached mere moments before, locked onto her with an intensity that could have melted steel. He watched as she trembled, a leaf caught in a hurricane, trying to make herself smaller, to vanish back into the shadows from which she had stumbled. She was terrified. She was humble. She was everything. He took a step forward, then another. The crowd parted before him like a sea before a divine wind, their faces a blur of shock and utter disbelief. The polished floor seemed to tremble with the weight of his purpose. He was deaf to the gasps, blind to Isolde's sharp intake of breath, unaware of Torrin's stunned silence behind him. His entire universe had narrowed, collapsed into this one trembling girl. He stopped before her. She flinched, still unable to lift her head, as if his gaze alone was a physical weight she could not hope to bear. Darius's voice, when it finally broke the silence of the hall, was not the cold and commanding tone of the Alpha King. It was low, rough, with an emotion so raw and unfamiliar it startled even him. It was reverence. It was awe. "Look at me." The command was a whisper, yet it carried the weight of a mountain, brooking no disobedience. Slowly, trembling as if each movement caused her pain, Sera lifted her head, and Darius found himself falling into the most extraordinary eyes he had ever seen. They were not the bold gold of a warrior or the enchanting violet of a sorceress. They were the color of a twilight sky after a cleansing storm, a deep, soulful gray, and in their depths he saw not ambition or cunning, but a quiet, resilient strength, and a fear so profound it stole the breath from his own lungs. In that single, heart-stopping moment, the grand hall, the nobles, the ceremony, it all melted into insignificance. The moon goddess had not been cruel. She had been saving her greatest masterpiece for last. His mate had been here all along, hidden in silence. But as he reached a hand toward her, a sudden, searing pain lanced through his temple. It was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a fleeting, disjointed image, a flash of a different symbol, not the crescent moon of his kingdom, but a radiant, stylized sun, etched onto a banner of deep crimson, a memory that was not his own. He dismissed it, a phantom sparked by the overwhelming shock of the moment. His focus, absolute and unwavering, returned to the girl before him. His voice filled the dead silence of the hall, every word a hammer striking the foundations of his kingdom's oldest traditions. "The ceremony is over." He paused, his gaze never leaving Sera's wide, terrified eyes. "My Luna has been found." The uproar was immediate, a cacophony of raised voices, protests, and confused shouts. But Darius heard none of it. He saw only the silent tears that began to trace glistening paths through the dust on Sera's cheeks. He did not know her. He did not know the secrets she guarded or the tempest his choice would unleash. He knew only one thing with an absolute, unshakable certainty that radiated from his very core. He had found her, and he would tear the world apart, stone by stone, to keep her. But as he led his stunned, silent Omega from the hall, a single treacherous thought whispered from the darkest corner of his mind. The pain, the fleeting image, was it truly just the shock of the moment? Or was it a warning, a prelude to a secret so deep, so devastating, that its revelation would not just challenge his kingdom, but shatter it completely? The heavy, iron-bound door of the royal chambers clicked shut with a sound of terrible finality. The second it did, the last vestiges of Sera's courage evaporated completely. The roaring silence of the opulent room was 1,000 times more deafening than the chaos of the hall. She stood frozen just inside the doorway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frantic, trapped bird. She could still feel the burn of 100 hostile stares on her skin, could still hear the earth-shattering echo of the king's declaration ringing in her ears. My Luna. It was a mistake, a beautiful, terrible, impossible mistake, a dream from which she would surely awaken to the familiar, harsh reality of scrub brushes and cold stone floors. She dared a glance around, her stormy eyes wide. The room was larger than the entire servants' quarters. A vaulted ceiling arched high above, lost in shadow, and a massive tapestry depicting the legendary first Alpha King and his Luna dominated one wall, their woven eyes seeming to watch her. A fire crackled in a hearth big enough to stand in, its warm, dancing glow playing over plush furs and furniture carved from dark, ancient wood. It was a world of impossible softness and light, a stark, cruel contrast to the cold stone and straw of the world she knew. King Darius moved away from her, his broad shoulders blocking the firelight for a moment, casting her into shadow. He poured water from a crystal pitcher into a matching goblet, the simple act performed with a lethal, unconscious grace. He was so immense. His presence did not just fill the space, it commanded it, making the grand room feel strangely small. The raw, untamed power that had radiated from him in the hall was now banked, a simmering heat beneath a veneer of control, but she could still feel it. A sleeping dragon shared the room with her. He turned and held out the goblet. Sera. Her name on his lips was a shock. It sounded foreign, important, like a jewel she was not worthy to hold. She flinched. Her gaze dropped instantly to the intricate patterns of the woven rug beneath her worn shoes. "Your Majesty," she whispered, the words tasting like ash and shame. A soft sigh, almost inaudible, escaped him. She heard his footsteps, then his boots, polished to a mere shine, came into her line of sight. He didn't touch her. "Look at me, please." It was the please that undid her. It was a request, not a command, from a king. Slowly, forcing her trembling limbs to obey, she lifted her eyes. The stormy gray of her gaze met his, a turbulent sky meeting a winter sea. There was no anger there, no regret for his shocking choice, only a deep, unsettling intensity and something else, a warmth that terrified her more than any threat ever could. "This is real, Sera," he said, his voice low and resonant, vibrating in the quiet space between them. "The moon goddess does not make errors. The bond I feel, it is the most real thing I have ever known." Tears welled in her eyes, blurring his majestic, stern features. "But you don't understand," she choked out, her voice breaking like thin ice. "I am no one. I have nothing. I can't read the old languages. I don't know the noble houses or their intricate games. I wouldn't know which fork to use at a state dinner, or which lord to trust, or how to wear a crown. I will be a humiliation to you." The confession tumbled out, a torrent of her deepest, most secret fears. Darius's expression softened, the hard lines around his eyes easing just a fraction. He set the goblet down on a nearby table of dark wood. "You think I need a queen who knows which fork to use." A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips, there and gone like a ghost. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who know which fork to use. They are the same people who plot and scheme behind elegant smiles and honeyed words. I do not need a political alliance carved from ambition. I have an army for strength and advisors for cunning. What I need, what I have been waiting for, is you." His words were a balm and a brand. They soothed the sharp edges of her insecurity while simultaneously sealing her fate with a heat she could not escape. He was not going to let her go. The certainty in his voice was absolute. But why? The question was a desperate plea, torn from the depths of her soul. "Why me?" "That is a question for the moon goddess," he replied, his gaze unwavering, pinning her in place. "My only task is to honor her will, and my wolf has chosen. It recognizes its other half in you. It knows its home." He took a step closer, and she held her breath. The air in her lungs turned to stone. He reached out, his fingers gently brushing a stray, tear-damp strand of hair from her cheek. The contact was electric. A jolt, warm and shocking, shot through her entire body, down to the soles of her feet. It wasn't unpleasant. It was a homecoming, a sense of rightness so profound, so fundamental, that it made her dizzy. For a fleeting, stolen second, the constant, gnawing anxiety that was her oldest companion quieted, soothed by his mere touch. She saw his eyes flare, the stormy gray brightening with a silver light. He felt it too, the connection. The truth of it was undeniable, a physical law of our universe as real and unchangeable as gravity. "The court will be hostile," he said, his hand dropping back to his side, though the phantom warmth of his touch lingered on her skin like a brand. "They will test you. They will try to break you, to prove their own worth by shattering yours. But you will not face them alone. I am your shield, Sera. From this moment on, no one will harm you. You are under my protection." The word protection should have been a comfort. It should have been a fortress. Instead, it sent a fresh wave of cold dread cascading through her veins, chilling her to the bone. Protection. If he knew the truth, the real truth that slept behind her eyes and whispered in her dreams, he wouldn't be offering protection. He would be calling for the executioner. He would be the one leading her to the block. She managed a shaky, jerky nod, unable to form any words around the lump of terror in her throat. He gestured toward a door on the far side of the room, adorned with a delicate carving of the moon phases. "Those are your chambers. You will find clothes and anything else you might need. Rest. Tomorrow we begin." Sera didn't need to be told twice. She practically fled across the room, her worn shoes silent on the thick rugs, slipping through the door and closing it behind her with a soft click. She leaned against the solid wood, her body sagging, as if barricading herself from the overwhelming, terrifying reality of him. Her new room was just as lavish, a dream made tangible. A bed larger than any she had ever seen, piled high with pillows and blankets that looked softer than cloud, dominated the space. A large window, framed by heavy velvet curtains, overlooked the moonlit palace gardens. She stumbled to the window, pressing her fevered forehead against the cool, flawless glass. Down below, in the deep shadows cast by the towering walls, she could see the faint, familiar glow of the kitchen windows. Her old life. A life of simple, predictable hardship, of aching muscles and empty bellies, but also of known boundaries and hidden safety. A single, treacherous thought whispered in her mind, sweet as poison. He was kind. He was everything the ballad said and more. And the bond, that inexplicable magnetic pull toward him, was a siren's call, tempting her to believe in this impossible fairy tale. But fairy tales were lies spun to comfort children, and her truth was a sleeping dragon coiled beneath the very foundations of this glittering castle, its breath a plume of hidden fire. She had to remember who she was. Not Sera, the servant girl, but Sera, the last daughter of the House of the Dawning Sun, the royal line his own father had systematically slaughtered to secure this throne, to cement his legacy in blood and ash. She was not the moon goddess's chosen Luna. She was a ghost, living in the house of her family's murderer, and the man who now called her his fated mate was the son of the king who ordered her entire world to the sword. The tears came then, silent and hopeless, a flood she could no longer dam. She was trapped in the most beautiful cage imaginable, promised love by her most hated enemy, and the weight of her secret was a chain around her soul, growing heavier, tighter with every treacherous beat of her yearning heart. The morning sun streamed into Sera's chambers like an uninvited guest, a cruel mockery of the storm raging silently within her. She had not slept a wink. Every rustle of the palace settling into day, every distant footfall in the corridor had sent her heart into a panicked flutter against her ribs. A maid arrived at dawn, a woman named Liana, with gentle eyes and a quiet, efficient demeanor. She carried a breakfast tray of fruits, warm bread, and honey, and over her arm lay a selection of gowns. The clothes were simple yet exquisite, crafted from fine linens and soft wools in muted colors, dove gray, pale lavender, the soft green of new moss. They were a universe away from her rough-spun servant's dress, which had been discreetly taken away, a relic of a vanished life. Liana helped her dress in the gray gown, which seemed to make her stormy eyes appear even larger, more haunted. "The king requests your presence in the sunroom, my lady," she said softly, her eyes carefully averted, a sign of respect that felt like 1,000 pinpricks on her skin. My lady? The title was a slap, a dissonant chord. She was no lady. She was a pretender in a castle of ghosts wearing borrowed robes. She found Darius standing by a large arched window, the morning light setting his broad shoulders and dark hair ablaze with a golden halo. He turned as she entered, and for a breathtaking, terrifying moment, she saw pure, unadulterated approval in his eyes. It was quickly veiled by his usual intense scrutiny, but the glimpse of it, so raw and genuine, sent a confusing, unwanted warmth spiraling through her. "Sera," he greeted her, "you look—" He seemed to search for the right word, his gaze traveling over the simple gown. Appropriate. It was not a romantic compliment. It was an assessment, a statement of fact. She was fitting in. Against all odds and reason, she was passing the first silent inspection. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she murmured, her eyes fixing on the intricate geometric pattern of the silk rug beneath her. "Darius," he corrected, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. "When we are in private, you will call me Darius." The intimacy of it was a new kind of terror. It was a claiming, a step across a boundary she was desperate to maintain. She simply nodded, a tight, jerky motion. "The Council of Elders has requested an audience," he stated, watching her closely, a hunter observing his prey's reaction. "They wish to greet their new Luna." The dread was a physical weight, a cold stone dropping into the pit of her stomach. This was it, the first true test. The wolves were gathering, and they would smell her fear, her unworthiness, her lie. "I understand," she whispered, the words barely audible. "You do not need to speak,"
he instructed, moving to stand directly before her, his presence a wall of solid assurance. You only need to be. Stand by my side, meet their gaze, let them feel the truth of the bond, the rightness of it. My authority is your authority now. Do not let them see your fear. Do not give them that weapon.
But I am fear, she wanted to scream. I am made of it. Instead, she took a deep, shuddering breath that did nothing to calm her, and nodded once more. He offered her his arm. It was a formal gesture, a royal expectation, but also one of profound solidarity. After a moment's agonizing hesitation, she placed her trembling fingers lightly on the dark velvet of his sleeve. The contact was just as electrifying as it had been the night before, a steady, warm current that seemed to flow from him into her, a silent transfusion of strength. It gave her a sliver of courage, thin as a razor's edge. The walk to the council chamber was a blur of towering stone arches, silent, armor-clad guards, and the oppressive weight of impending judgment. Torin joined them, falling into step, a pace behind Darius. The beta gave her a brief, unreadable glance as he passed, his expression a carefully schooled mask of neutral observation that felt more accusing than any glare. The doors to the council chamber, heavy oak-banded with iron, swung open without a sound, and the low murmur of powerful voices ceased instantly. The room was a cavern of power, filled with the most dominant alphas in the kingdom, old warriors with faces like cracked leather, young strategists with cold, calculating eyes, elders who carried the weight of tradition like a mantle. Their combined aura was a suffocating pressure, a physical force pushing against her. Sera felt her knees weaken, a treacherous trembling beginning in her legs, but Darius's arm beneath her hand was unyielding as iron. He led her to the head of the long, polished blackwood table and stood, refusing to take his seat, a subtle power play that forced everyone in the room to remain standing. "Elders," Darius's voice rang out, cool as a mountain stream and just as unforgiving. "You requested an audience with your Luna." An elderly man with a sharp, hawk-like face and a beard as white as freshly fallen snow stepped forward. Lord Corvus. Sera recognized him from fearful whispers in the kitchens. He was the head of the council, a traditionalist carved from stone and ancient law, a man who believed the world had a fixed and immutable order. "Your Majesty," Lord Corvus began, his voice like dry parchment rubbing together. His cold, pale blue eyes swept over Sera, dismissing her in an instant, seeing only a stain on his perfect world. "We are, of course, eager to welcome the one the moon goddess has chosen. However, the circumstances of the selection have left many with pressing questions. The stability of the kingdom, the strength of the pack, rests upon the unshakable foundation of its alpha and the legitimacy of its Luna. We must be certain, for the good of all." "Are you questioning the will of the moon goddess, Corvus?" Darius's tone was deceptively soft, but a lethal edge lay beneath it, the sharpness of a blade hidden in silk. "Of course not, sire," Corvus replied smoothly, though his eyes glinted with a hard, flinty light. "We are merely examining the vessel, an omega, a servant, with no known lineage, no proven strength, no understanding of our ways. How can she possibly stand as your equal? How can she command the respect, the instinctive obedience of the packs? How can she be the heart of a kingdom when she has only known its darkest corners?" Sera felt the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold and lightheaded. This was worse, far worse than she had imagined. The hostility was not veiled. It was naked, sharp, and designed to flay her alive. "It is not her lineage that makes her my equal," Darius countered, his voice dropping, becoming lethally quiet, the calm before a cataclysm. "It is the bond,
a bond I feel with every fiber of my being, with every beat of my heart. That is all the legitimacy she or I require. That is the highest law. But the people, another councilman, younger but with the same coldness in his eyes, started. The people will follow their king. Darius's voice cracked through the room like a whip of pure energy, his alpha power rolling out in a visible, palpable wave that made several elders physically flinch, grasping the table for support. Sera felt it too, a terrifying, magnificent force, a tsunami of raw dominance, but it washed over her like a warm, protective tide, leaving her untouched, standing securely in the eye of his storm. She is my chosen, she is your Luna. You will offer her your allegiance here and now, or you will answer to me. The choice is simple. The silence that followed was absolute, thick enough to choke on. Lord Corvus's face was a stony mask, unreadable, but after a long, tense moment, he gave a stiff, shallow bow in Sera's direction, a motion that spoke of surrender, but promised a long, cold war. As you command, Your Majesty. His words were submission, but his eyes, when they flicked to her, were a vow of relentless opposition. The audience was over. Darius turned, his posture rigid with controlled fury, and led her from the room. They were halfway down the long tapestry-lined corridor when he stopped abruptly, turning to face her. His stormy eyes searched her face, looking for damage, for cracks. You see, he said, his voice softening marginally, they are all bark and bluster. They have their traditions, their pride, but they cannot touch you. They cannot break what the moon goddess has forged. But Sera was shaking, a fine, constant tremor she could not stop. She had seen the pure, undiluted hatred in Corvus's eyes, the cold calculation. They couldn't touch her physically, not with Darius as her impenetrable shield, but they could undermine her, isolate her, whisper poison into every ear in the kingdom, and if they ever, by some awful chance, discovered her secret, they would not just touch her, they would tear her apart with glee, and they would drag Darius down from his throne in the ensuing chaos. She would be the ruin of him. She had survived the first test, but as she looked into Darius's confident, possessive face, feeling the ghost of his protection around her, she knew with a sickening, soul-deep certainty that it was only the beginning. The walls of her gilded cage were not just closing in, they were growing teeth, and the dragon of her past was beginning to stir in its ancient, bloody sleep. The days began to form a new, surreal pattern for Sera, a rhythm as unfamiliar as a foreign tongue. Her life was no longer defined by the back-breaking, mind-numbing labor of the kitchens, but by a different, more exhausting kind of work, the perpetual, high-stakes performance of being a Luna.
Mornings were spent with Liana, learning the intricate, constricting layers of royal attire, how to move in gowns that whispered against the floor, how to sit without crumpling the delicate fabrics. Afternoons involved silent, agonizing walks through the palace gardens with Darius, where she could feel the curious, hostile, and calculating stares of the courtiers from behind every sculpted hedge and marble statue. Evenings were the worst, spent in the cavernous grand dining hall, pushing exquisite food around her golden plate while nobles made veiled, cutting comments just loud enough for her to overhear, their words designed to wound and belittle. Through it all, Darius was a constant, immovable presence. He was patient, in a way that unnerved her, systematically teaching her the names and histories of the noble houses, the complex geography of his vast kingdom, the intricate web of alliances, grudges, and simmering conflicts that formed the fragile tapestry of his rule. He never pressed her to speak in public, shielding her from direct confrontation, but in the solitude of their shared chambers, though she still retreated every night to her separate room behind the locked door, he would ask for her thoughts, her opinions, treating her mind as a worthy counterpart to his own.
The eastern marches are reporting bandit raids on their supply caravans. The local lord wants to raise taxes to fund a larger garrison. What would you do? He asked one evening, the fire casting dancing shadows across his pensive face. She had been staring into the flames, seeking answers in the shifting light, and the question startled her. I don't know, Your Darius. Using his name still felt like a dangerous incantation, a spell she had no right to cast. Think, he urged, his voice low and compelling. Not as a queen trained in statecraft, but as someone who has known scarcity. What is the right thing to do? She looked at him then, truly looked, past the king to the man. He wasn't testing her knowledge from a scroll. He was asking for her soul, her perspective, the perspective of the people his council of wealthy, powerful alphas so often forgot. The memory of hollow stomachs in the servants' hall, of stretching a meager stew to feed everyone, of the shared, quiet desperation when supplies ran low, rose in her mind, vivid and painful. You cannot command loyalty from an empty stomach, she said softly, her gaze returning to the hypnotic fire. If the people are hungry and afraid, if they feel their king takes more than he gives, their loyalty will wither and die. A king who provides in lean times, who shares the burden, earns a devotion that lasts through seasons of plenty. But if you simply give it, if you lift the tax, others will see it as weakness and make the same demand. So you don't just give, you invest. She paused, gathering her thoughts. Do not raise their taxes. Instead, send a contingent of the royal guard to help train their own militia, to patrol the roads with them. And in exchange, ask the eastern marches to send a percentage of their timber, not as a tax, but as a trade, to help rebuild the bridges in the flood-ravaged southern villages. That way, it is not a gift that breeds resentment, or a demand that breeds anger. It is a partnership. Their pride remains intact, they feel protected, and your entire kingdom grows stronger, woven together. The room was silent for a long, stretching moment. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the frantic beating of her own heart. When she finally dared to glance at him, his expression was unreadable, his face carved from shadow and flame, but his stormy eyes burned with an intensity, a new kind of respect that made her breath catch in her throat. That, he said quietly, the word hanging in the air like a revelation, is wisdom, a kind of strategic compassion no war general, no aged advisor could ever teach me. You see the threads that connect us all. A fragile, unfamiliar feeling blossomed in the frozen tundra of her chest. It was pride, sharp and sweet, but it was instantly, heavily tainted with a corrosive, sickening guilt. She was helping him, the son of her mortal enemy, become a better king. She was strengthening the very throne that had been built upon the scorched earth and bleached bones of her family, her people. She was weaving strength into the fabric of her own oppressor's legacy. It was after one such lesson, her mind reeling from the moral quicksand she was sinking into, that she wandered into the palace library, seeking solace in the silence. The library was a forest of knowledge, shelves stretching up into darkness, lined with leather-bound books whose titles were written in languages she could not decipher. Her fingers trailed over the spines, feeling the imprint of history she was forbidden to know. She turned a corner into a secluded, dusty alcove, forgotten by time, and found herself facing a massive cloth-draped painting leaning against the stone wall. A corner of the dusty velvet had slipped away, revealing a glimpse of the image beneath, a glint of gold, a flash of dark color. Driven by a morbid, irresistible curiosity she could not suppress, a pull from the deepest part of her being, she reached up and carefully tugged the cloth away. She stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. It was a portrait of the previous king, Darius's father, Alistair. He stood proud and severe and utterly merciless in his legendary onyx battle armor. But it wasn't him that stole the air from my lungs, that made the world tilt on its axis. It was the banner held by a knight in the background, partially unfurled, a banner I knew in my nightmares, in the secret hymns of my childhood, a radiant, stylized sun, its rays like blades of light on a field of deepest blood crimson, the standard of the house of the dawning sun, my house. And there, tucked almost out of sight at the very edge of the painting, half turned as if caught leaving the frame, was a woman. She had kind, sorrowful eyes the color of a misty morning and hair the shade of warm ash, and around her neck she wore a simple, elegant silver necklace from which hung a delicate crescent moon pendant. Sera's own hand flew to her throat, where the necklace Darius had given her just days before now lay against her skin. It was identical, a perfect match. A sob caught in her throat, strangling her. The stories from her childhood, whispered in the dark by her old nurse, came flooding back in a torrent. The story of the compassionate queen from the rival Moonstone Kingdom, a woman who had believed in peace, who had tried to broker a secret truce. She had exchanged tokens with the Luna of the dawning sun as a sacred sign of goodwill, a promise between mothers for a better future before the war broke out in a storm of fire and betrayal. This was her, Darius's mother, Queen Lenore.
The world spun, the dusty shelves blurring. The kind-eyed queen in the painting, the mother Darius rarely spoke of, had worn this very symbol. He hadn't just given her a random piece of jewelry from the royal vault. He had given her a sacred heirloom, a piece of his own mother's hopeful heart, a woman who had believed in peace, who had reached out to Sera's own mother in secret, a woman whose hopes had been buried in the same grave as Sera's family. Just then, she heard the soft, deliberate sound of footsteps on the stone floor. Panicked, her heart leaping into her throat, she yanked the dusty cloth back over the panting, her movements frantic. She turned, smoothing her features into what she hoped was a blank mask, to see Lady Isolde standing at the entrance to the alcove, a cold, knowing smile etched on her perfectly beautiful lips. "Looking for something, little Omega?" Isolde's voice was a silken poison, dripping with false concern. "Or perhaps remembering something?" Sera's blood turned to ice in her veins. It had to be a casual, cruel barb. There was no way Isolde could know. The painting had been hidden, forgotten, and yet the look in Isolde's cold blue eyes was too calculated, too full of a malicious, gloating glee, as if she had just cornered her prey. "The past is such a crowded place, don't you think? So full of interesting ghosts. It would be a true shame, a tragedy, really, if one of them decided to stop haunting the shadows and walk among the living again. The living so rarely appreciate the company." Before Sera could form a response, her mind frozen with terror, a voice cut through the thick tension from behind Isolde, deep and edged with unmistakable authority. "Is there a problem?" Darius stood there, having entered the library silently. His gaze shifted from Isolde's smug, composed face to Sera's pale, visibly terrified one. The air in the alcove grew heavy, thick with his unspoken, simmering power. Isolde's smile didn't falter, but it became brittle, a crack in her perfect porcelain facade. "Not at all, Your Majesty," she purred, dipping into a graceful, mocking curtsy. "I was just welcoming our new Luna to the library's many treasures. It holds so much history. One must be careful not to get lost in it." With a last, lingering glance at Sera that promised unfinished business, she swept away.
her scent lingering in the air like a threat. Darius moved to Sera's side, his presence a solid, calming wall between her and the departed threat. "What did she say to you?" His voice was low, a quiet rumble of protective fury. Ilera shook her head, unable to speak past the lump of sheer, unadulterated terror clogging her throat. She couldn't tell him. She couldn't tell him about the painting, about the necklace, about the ghosts that were suddenly so much more than memories. They were connections, threads tying her to him in a way he could never, ever imagine. His own mother had reached out to hers in a secret plea for peace. The irony was a bitter, choking poison. Sleep offered no refuge for Sera that night. The face of the kind-eyed queen, the stark crimson and gold of the dawning sun banner, and Isolde's venomous, knowing smile swirled in her mind, forming a terrifying tapestry she could not escape. The necklace felt like a brand against her skin, a beautiful, heavy shackle, a constant reminder of a past that connected her to Darius in a way he could never, ever imagine. His own mother had reached out to hers in a secret plea for peace. The next morning, a formal summons arrived, delivered by a stone-faced page. The autumn equinox festival was fast approaching, the largest and most sacred celebration in the kingdom, and the Luna was expected to oversee the final preparations with the royal steward. It was her first real public duty, a chance to prove her worth, or, in the eager watching eyes of the court, to fail spectacularly and publicly. The steward, a perpetually flustered man named Finian, awaited her in the grand receiving room, his arms piled high with scrolls, ledgers, and fabric swatches. He bowed so low she feared he would topple forward onto the marble. "My Lady Luna," he stammered, adjusting his spectacles. The floral arrangements for the Great Hall, we have the traditional moon lilies, of course, sourced from the royal greenhouse, but the head florist is insisting that Dawn Star blooms are in unprecedented, shocking abundance this season in the wild meadows, and wishes to include them. They are rather vibrant, a bold choice. Sera's breath hitched, catching in her chest. Dawn Star blooms, the royal flower of the dawning sun. They didn't just grow wild in Moonstone territory. Their sudden, rampant presence was not an accident of nature. It was a deliberate act, a message planted and cultivated. Her heart began to hammer a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. This was Isolde's doing. It had to be. A test, a trap woven from petals and thorns. She could feel the eyes of the few courtiers loitering in the room, pretending to examine tapestries, fixed on her. This was the snare. If she approved the fiery orange blooms, it could be seen as a bizarre, even treasonous nod to a vanquished enemy's symbol. If she denied them, she would look petty, insecure, rejecting the kingdom's natural bounty, portraying herself as afraid of a simple flower. She forced her voice to remain steady, to find a calm she did not feel. "The moon lilies are a sacred tradition," she began, seeing Finian's shoulders slump in anticipated disappointment. "But the goddess in her wisdom provides both the moon that guides us and the sun that gives us life. A celebration of the equinox is a balance, a harmony of both light and dark, of night and day." She paused, thinking rapidly. "Let us have the moon lilies lining the main tables and adorning the high arches, as is our custom, and place the Dawn Star blooms in great copper urns by the eastern windows, so the rising sun may stream through their petals on the morning of the festival. Let them be a tribute to the balance of our world, a recognition that one cannot exist without the other.
Finian's face lit up with profound relief and surprised admiration. A brilliant solution, my lady. Poetic, even. It honors tradition while embracing the unique bounty of the season. I shall see to it at once. A murmur of reluctant, grudging approval passed through the onlookers. It was a small victory, a clever diplomatic maneuver, but it tasted like ash in her mouth. She had just sanctioned the symbol of her murdered house, the flower that grew on the graves of her ancestors, to decorate the hall of her enemies, twisting its meaning to serve her own survival. The guilt was a cold, slick stone sitting in the pit of her stomach. Later, seeking air to clear her whirling thoughts, she walked the high, wind-swept battlements. The view of the kingdom was breathtaking, but it only made her feel more isolated, a stranger looking upon a land that should have been hers by birthright. The crunch of gravel announced a presence, and Torin fell into step beside her. He had been a silent, watchful shadow since her arrival, his loyalty to Darius absolute, but his feelings toward her a tightly locked mystery. That was deftly handled with the flowers, he said, his tone neutral, his eyes scanning the horizon as if expecting an attack from any direction. She glanced at him, wary. It was just flowers, a simple matter of aesthetics. Nothing in this court is just anything, my lady, he replied, his voice low and serious. A flower is a statement. A ribbon is an allegiance. A glance is a plotted move. You are learning that quickly, perhaps too quickly for someone from the kitchens. He paused, choosing his next words with the care of a man laying a trap. The king, he sees a light in you, a purity, a goodness. He believes this kingdom has lost beneath layers of politics and power. I pray to the moon goddess for his sake and for yours, that what he sees is not merely a reflection of his own hope. His words were not a direct threat, but a warning sharper than any blade, a confirmation that he too was watching, waiting, piecing together a puzzle whose final image he did not yet know but deeply suspected. He was the guardian of the king, and she was an unknown variable in his carefully calculated equation. That night, the dream came. It was no longer a hazy memory or a feeling of dread. It was a vivid, sensory nightmare, so real she could taste the smoke. She was a child again, so small, hidden in a secret compartment behind a heavy woven wall hanging in the nursery, peering through a crack in the wood. The air was thick, acrid with smoke and the unmistakable metallic scent of blood. She could hear the distant, terrifying clash of steel, the screams that were suddenly cut short. Her mother's voice, frantic, whispered through the wood, her final command. Whatever you hear, my darling star, do not make a sound. Be still as the new moon, be silent as the grave. Then the door to her chamber splintered inward with the sound of shattering dreams. A man in the imposing, familiar onyx and silver armor of Moonstone stood there, his sword dripping crimson behind him. Gripping his own smaller practice sword was a boy no more than 10 or 11 years old, with serious, stormy eyes and a face pale but set in a grim, forced mask of acceptance. The man, King Alistar, put a heavy, gauntleted hand on his shoulder. His voice was cold, final. This, Darius, is the price of defiance, the cost of opposing our will. Remember it. Let it forge you. Sera awoke with a gasping sob, sitting bolt upright in the vast bed, her body drenched in a cold sweat that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. The phantom sense of smoke and blood clogged her nostrils. Darius, he had been there.
He had witnessed the destruction of her home, the end of her world. He had stood in the ruins of her life as a dark lesson from his father. The pieces of the haunting vision snapped together with horrifying, devastating clarity. The fleeting pain in his temple at the ceremony, the disjointed image of the sun banner, it wasn't a random memory surfacing. The bond, this profound, inescapable connection, was trying to bridge the gap, to show him the truth his conscious mind had buried or deliberately forgotten. Their souls were so powerfully intertwined, they were beginning to unearth the very thing that should, by all rights, keep them eternally apart. She wrapped herself around herself, rocking back and forth on the bed as if the motion could soothe the earthquake within her. The man she was, against her will, beginning to care for, the man whose touch felt like a fragment of a home she'd never known, had been present at the massacre of her family. He may not have wielded the sword himself, but he had borne witness. He had been a part of that horrific night, a part of her deepest, most defining trauma. The secret was no longer just a political liability, a risk to her life. It was a personal, emotional abyss, a chasm that now lay between their connected souls. To tell him would destroy the fragile, impossible trust growing between them and would almost certainly sign her death warrant. But to stay silent was to live a profound, intimate lie with the one person her soul was screaming was her ultimate truth. And now with Isolde circling like a shark scenting blood, with Torin watching her every move with growing suspicion, and with the bond itself threatening to betray her at any moment, time was running out. The echo of the dawning sun was no longer a faint whisper. It was a growing drumbeat in her blood, and soon she feared everyone in the kingdom would hear its deafening scream. The Silvercrest Kingdom donned its most dazzling robes for the Autumn Equinox Festival, transforming from a fortress of power into a dreamscape of light. The Great Hall, usually a place of solemn judgment and weighty decisions, had been reborn as a symphony of music and shimmering color. Garlands of white moon lilies draped the high tables like frozen starlight, while in the massive copper urns by the arched eastern windows, the vibrant orange and gold dawn star blooms blazed like taptured suns, just as Sera had directed. Her compromise was on display for all to see. A balance of night and day, a testament to a Luna who understood nuance, who could weave tradition with something new. She saw the approving, thoughtful nods from some of the younger, more progressive nobles, and the stony, impassive silence from elders like Lord Corvus. Darius stood beside her at the head of the hall, resplendent in his formal regalia of black and deepest blue, the silver moon of his house gleaming on his chest. His pride was a tangible thing, a warm, steady ember in the cool fortress of his usual demeanor. He leaned down, his voice for her alone, a private island in the public sea. You see, they are beginning to see you as I do, not as a servant, but as a queen, not as an omega, but as a mind. If only he knew. She felt like the greatest fraud in history, standing amidst the symbolic flowers of her own slaughtered house, a ghost wearing the borrowed crown of a queen. She was dressed in a gown of twilight blue, the color of the sky moments before night fully claims it, and around her neck the crescent moon pendant felt heavier than ever, a holy weight. It was a night of masks, both literal and figurative. Many of the courtiers wore elaborate half-masks adorned with feathers and jewels, adding to the air of mystery, deception, and hidden identities. The music swelled, a sweeping, majestic waltz, and the dancing began. Darius led her out for the first formal dance, a tradition as old as the kingdom itself. Her hand was small and cold in his large, warm one, her other resting lightly on the solid muscle of his shoulder. He was a pillar, a guiding force, his steps sure and confident, leading her through the intricate patterns as if they had danced together 1,000 times. "You are trembling," he murmured, his stormy eyes searching hers from behind his own simple, elegant silver mask. "I'm not used to being the center of so many eyes," she whispered back, which was not a lie, merely a sliver of the terrifying truth. "Then look only at me," he said, his voice a low, compelling command that felt strangely like a shelter. "Forget they exist. In this moment, there is only the music and us." And for a few fleeting, stolen moments, she did. The world narrowed, contracted, to the sacred space between their bodies, to the warmth of his hand on the small of her back, to the steady, sinking rhythm of their hearts. The music, the glittering lights, the whispering, watching crowd, it all faded into a distant, irrelevant hum. In his arms, surrounded by his strength, the lie felt less like a prison and more like a desperate, cherished dream from which she never wanted to awaken. She could almost believe it was real, that she was just Sera, and he was just Darius, and their story was just beginning. But the dream shattered as the final notes of the waltz faded into applause. A smooth, familiar, hated voice cut through the polite clapping like a shard of ice. "A beautiful performance, Your Majesty. You lead with such unwavering strength, a true alpha." Lady Isidel stood before them, wearing a mask of sapphire blue feathers that did nothing to hide the calculating malice in her eyes. She was holding 2 delicate, fluted crystal glasses filled with sparkling pale gold wine. "A toast," she declared, her voice carrying effortlessly across the immediate crowd, "to our king and to his surprising new Luna. May her reign be as illuminating and as unexpectedly vibrant as the dawn star blooms she has so boldly chosen to showcase." The barb was perfectly aimed, honed to a razor's edge. It sounded like a compliment, a celebration of her choice, but Sera heard the venom coiled beneath every syllable. Unexpectedly vibrant, a reminder of her lowly, unexpected origin. Isidel offered one of the glasses to Sera with a graceful, predatory smile. A cold dread, sharp as a winter wind, trickled down Sera's spine. It was a public test, a gauntlet thrown in silk and crystal. To refuse the toast from such a high-ranking lady would be a grave, unpardonable insult, a sign of weakness and fear. To accept felt like willingly drinking from a poisoned cup, stepping into a snare laid in full view of the court. Her eyes flickered to Darius, but he was watching Isidel, his expression an unreadable mask of polite attention, giving nothing away. With a hand that she forced to steadiness, she reached for the offered glass. As her fingers brushed against the cool, smooth crystal, a jolt, sharp and blindingly painful, lanced through her skull. It was stronger than anything before, not a memory, but a vision, a warning. She saw Isidel, without her mask, in a shadowy, deserted corridor of the palace, handing a small apothecary's vial of murky liquid to a trembling kitchen maid. A single drop in her wineglass only, enough to cause a disruptive episode, to make her seem unstable, emotionally frail, unfit for public view. Nothing lethal, just a spectacle. The vision lasted less than a heartbeat, but it was paralyzing in its clarity. The bond wasn't just showing her the past, it was screaming a warning about the present, an immediate physical threat. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of heightened tension for Sera. She had survived the public gauntlet, but the cost was a terrifying new knowledge. The bond had given her a weapon,
a glimpse behind the curtains of her enemy's plans, but it was also a profound liability. These visions, these echoes of intent, they were unpredictable, overwhelming. What if the next one came at a worse time? What if it revealed not Isolde's plot, but her own secret, at the most disastrous possible moment? Later, as the festival began to wind down and the guests grew languid with wine and music, Darius led her out onto a secluded balcony overlooking the moon-washed gardens. The sounds of the celebration were a distant, cheerful murmur, a world away. "What happened back there with Isolde?" he asked, his voice low, no longer the public king, but the private, probing man. He was not angry, but intensely curious, his sharp mind having noted the subtle currents beneath the surface. "You were startled, more than a simple refusal would warrant." Sera leaned against the cold stone balustrade, letting its solidity ground her, her energy utterly spent. She couldn't tell him about the vision. How could she explain it without revealing the bond's strange, frightening depth? But she could give him a shard of the truth, a piece of the iceberg. "She does not like me," Sera said softly, staring at the full moon hanging heavy in the velvet sky. "I believe her dislike runs deeper than mere rivalry or wounded pride. I believe she would go to great and perhaps dark lengths to see me fall from your grace, to prove me unworthy." Darius was silent for a long, contemplative moment, the moonlight painting his profile in silver and shadow. "Isolde is the daughter of Duke Valerius, one of my most powerful and ambitious lords. Her aspirations have always been considerable. She envisioned herself on this balcony, standing where you stand. But she is nothing, a shadow of ambition without substance. You looked at me tonight in that hall, and you saw only me. You trusted me to lead you. And then, when faced with a veiled threat, you trusted your own instinct, your own wit to protect yourself. That quiet strength, that inner compass, that is the mark of a true Luna. That is what they will never understand, and what they can never take from you." He cupped her face then, his touch gentle, reverent, his thumb stroking her cheek with a tenderness that shattered her defenses. "You called me my love." Sera's breath caught, lodging in her throat. She had done it as a tactic, a move in their deadly public game, to sell the lie, to solidify their image. But the way he said it now, in the private moonlight, with such quiet, wondering intensity, made it feel terrifyingly, beautifully real. "It was just for the court," she whispered, her walls crumbling to dust under his touch, under his gaze. "Was it?" he asked, his voice barely a breath, his stormy eyes holding hers, seeing through every one of her fragile, self-preserving walls. He didn't move to kiss her, respecting the unspoken, trembling boundaries she had erected. He simply stood there, his hand on her face, his gaze asking a question her soul was desperate, against all reason and history, to answer with a scream of yes. In that suspended moment on the moonlit balcony, the line between the lie she lived and the truth she felt blurred into nothingness, into a beautiful, painful haze. She was Sera, the servant girl, and she was the Luna of Moonstone. She was the last daughter of the dawning sun, and she was the fated mate of the king whose family had extinguished its light. The war was no longer just outside, in the glittering hostile court. It was here, inside her own ravaged heart, and with every beat she felt herself losing the battle, surrendering to a love that was destined to destroy them both. The fragile, moon-drenched piece of the balcony shattered, with the sound of frantic, running footsteps on stone.
Torin emerged from the shadows of the doorway, his face grim, etched with urgency. "Your Majesty, a situation requires your immediate attention in the West Wing servants' passage." Darius's hand dropped from Sera's face, the tender connection severing as if cut by a knife. The private man vanished, replaced in an instant by the alert, formidable Alpha King. "What is it?" Torin's gaze flickered to Sera, then back to his king, his hesitation speaking volumes. "It's best you see for yourself." A cold knot, hard and unforgiving, tightened in Sera's stomach. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the marrow, that this was not a coincidence. This was the aftermath, the ripple from the stone Isolde had thrown into the pond of the festival. They followed Torin through the now quieting halls, leaving the music and laughter behind, descending into the less traveled utilitarian corridors of the palace. The air grew cooler, smelling of stone and soap. In a secluded servants' passage, a scene of quiet chaos greeted them. A young kitchen maid, her face streaked with tears, was sobbing hysterically, held firmly by two stern-faced royal guards. On the stone floor beside her lay the shattered, glittering remains of a crystal wineglass, the very one Sera had refused. A dark, wine-colored stain spread from the broken shards, like a blood stain. And in the center of that stain, curled and lifeless, lay a small, bright-feathered songbird. "She was seen tampering with the glass after it was cleared from the hall, Your Majesty," one of the guards reported, his voice tight. "We found this hidden in her apron." He held out the small, glass apothecary's vial from Sera's vision. It was empty. The maid looked up, her eyes wide with animal terror. "I didn't know. I swear on the moon goddess. She said it was just a tonic, a harmless tincture to make the Luna more agreeable, more at ease. She said it would calm her nerves. I didn't know it would kill anything." Darius's face was a mask of cold, controlled fury, more terrifying than any shouted rage. "Who?" The single word was laced with deadly, quiet promise, a vow of vengeance. The maid trembled, pointing a shaking finger not toward the grand halls where the nobility resided, but down a darker, narrower corridor that led to the palace's underbelly. "To the herbalist's apprentice, Corbin. He gave it to me. He said it was on the orders of a high-ranking lady, a lady of the court. But he was too scared to say who. He made me swear secrecy." It was a dead end, meticulously crafted. The apprentice, a lowly, disposable pawn, would never talk, or would vanish before he could. The maid was merely the delivery mechanism, another sacrificial piece. Isolde had covered her tracks with the precision of a master strategist, sacrificing the smallest players to protect the queen. But everyone in that cold stone corridor knew the truth. The attempt had been real, and its failure had forced the conspirators to clean up their mess, leaving behind this tragic, avian casualty. Darius dismissed the guards with a sharp gesture, ordering the weeping maid to be taken to the dungeons for further, though likely fruitless, questioning. His silence as they walked back through the silent palace to their chambers was more terrifying than any outburst could have been. The power rolling off him was a contained thunderstorm, lightning crackling beneath a veneer of ice. Once inside the sanctuary of their rooms, he turned to face her. The kingly mask was gone, replaced with a stark, raw intensity. You knew. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation, and a revelation. She wrapped her arms around herself. The image of the small, dead bird burned into her mind's eye. I suspected, the way she offered it, her smile. It felt wrong, a feeling in my gut. "You are a poor liar, Sera," he said, his voice low and intense, cutting through her pretense. "You didn't suspect. You knew. How?" She was trapped, cornered. She couldn't tell him about the vision, the bond's terrifying new facet. Her mind raced, scrambling for a half-truth, a plausible lie to cover a miraculous truth. I have a sensitivity to certain poisons. I can smell them, a faint, bitter almond scent on the air. There was a trace of it on the rim of the glass. It was a desperate, thin gamble. The scent of bitter almonds was associated with a specific deadly compound, but it was a known check for poison. He stared at her, his piercing gaze seeming to strip away every layer of her being, searching for the core of her deception. He didn't believe her. The explanation was too convenient, too perfectly tailored, but he also had no other framework, no other logic to explain the impossible. The tension stretched between them, taut and quivering like a bowstring. Finally, he let out a long, controlled breath, the fight leaving his shoulders, not in defeat, but in the acceptance of a new, unsettling reality. He continued, his voice low. "From this moment on, Torin or I taste everything you eat or drink. Every morsel, every sip. No exceptions. Your safety is not a matter for chance or feeling." He walked to the window, his broad back to her, staring out at the sleeping kingdom. "This ends now. I have been too lenient, too patient with the snakes that slither through my court. They have misunderstood my focus on you, my belief in our bond, for a weakness they can exploit. They are wrong." "What will you do?" Sera asked, her voice small in the vast, tense room. "What a king must do," he replied, his tone flat, final, and utterly ruthless. "I will remind them why they fear me, why they pledged their allegiance in the first place, not to a gentle hand, but to an unbreakable will." The next day, the change in the palace atmosphere was immediate and palpable, a shift from whispered intrigue to a silence heavy with dread. The king's guard seemed to double, their presence a constant, silent, menacing promise in every corridor and hall. Lord Corvus was summoned to a private, closed-door meeting in the king's war room, from which he emerged an hour later, his face ashen, his lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Rumors swirled like toxic smoke that the king had ordered a sudden, ruthless audit of the financial records and land grants of several prominent houses, including Isolde's family, with a forensic eye for any discrepancy, any hint of disloyalty or independent power building. It was a purge, not of blood yet, but of influence, comfort, and wealth. Darius was systematically, coldly dismantling the power base of his enemies, brick by political brick, showing them that the price for touching what was his would be utter ruin. Sera should have felt safe. She should have felt protected, cherished. Instead, she felt a growing, suffocating dread, a cage of guilt closing around her. Darius was waging a silent, brutal war for her, a war based on a foundation of lies. Every move he made to shield her, every act of ruthless protection was another layer of her betrayal. He was defending a queen who, by the brutal accident of birth and history, was his natural enemy. He was burning bridges and toppling pillars to protect a ghost. That night, the bond gave her another vision, the most powerful, the most invasive one yet. It was no longer a fleeting image or a warning of immediate danger. It was a full, immersive memory. His memory. She was no longer just a viewer. She was living it. She was seeing through the eyes of a young boy. The heavy, unfamiliar weight of formal armor pressed on his small shoulders. He stood in a grand, sun-drenched throne room, but it was a throne room of warm gold and vibrant crimson tapestries, not cool silver and blue. A kind-faced man with a crown of intertwined golden oak leaves stood before him, his expression not of anger, but of profound, weary sadness. "There is no need for this, Alistair," he said, not to the boy, but to the imposing figure beside him, Darius's father. "We can have peace. Our children can know a different world." Then the world exploded in violence. The boy, Darius, was forced to watch, his father's gauntleted hand a vice of iron on his shoulder, as the king of the dawning sun was cut down by a moonstone knight, and as he fell, his eyes the color of a storm-washed sky, so familiar it stole her breath, locked not on his killer, but on the boy. There was no hatred in that dying gaze, only a bottomless, heartbreaking pity, and a sorrow for the future being stolen from them both. Sera woke with a gasping cry, bolting upright, the phantom scent of incense and blood in her nostrils, the echo of that pitying gaze seared into her soul. Darius's memory. He had not just been a passive witness to a glorious conquest, he had been a prisoner of his father's cruelty and paranoia, forced to watch an act of pointless, tragic brutality.
The king of the dawning sun, her own grandfather, had died with a plea for peace on his lips, looking at a boy he knew was being forged into a weapon. The revelation shattered her. It broke the very foundation of her hatred. The childhood image of a monstrous, gleeful moonstone prince bathing in destruction crumbled to dust. He had been a child. A traumatized, powerless child, forced to witness a horror that had scarred him as deeply as it had her. The war, the massacre, it was his father's legacy of blood and tyranny, not his. He was as much a victim of Alistair's ruthlessness as she was. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent, a flood of grief for the boy he had been, for the man forced to bear a crown of thorns, the man she was, against all will, falling in love with, was not the monster she had been taught to hate. He was a fellow survivor, scarred by the same violence, haunted by the same ghosts. The secret that stood between them was no longer just her burden, her cross to bear. It was their shared tragedy, a wound on the soul of both their houses. But this new, devastating understanding made the truth only more dangerous, more impossible. To tell him now would not only reveal her identity, but it would force him to confront the horrific reality that his father was not a heroic unifier, but a murderer who had slaughtered a man of peace in front of his own son. It would destroy the official history his kingdom was built upon, the narrative that gave his rule its legitimacy. It would break him. The crack in her heart was now a yawning chasm, and she was standing on the crumbling edge, looking down into an abyss of pain that threatened to consume them both, to swallow the fragile love growing in the darkness whole. The revelation of Darius's haunted, unwilling past settled over Sera like a heavy, damp shroud, changing the very air she breathed. The image of the boy forced to witness a massacre, his small hand in his father's iron grip, was a far cry from the proud, conquering heir she had imagined and hated. The hatred that had been the bedrock of her identity, the fuel for her survival, began to crumble into dust, leaving behind a confusing, treacherous landscape of pity, aching understanding, and a terrifying, deepening affection that felt like a betrayal of her own blood. Every time he looked at her now with that fierce, protective pride, it felt like a dagger twisting in her soul, because she knew the cost of his own childhood, and she was lying to him about hers. He was planning a future for them, a future she knew was built on quicksand, on the unmarked grave of her family.
"We will tour the northern provinces at the first thaw," he announced one morning over a breakfast she could not bring herself to eat, his voice filled with a quiet, determined excitement that broke her heart anew. "The northern provinces, it is a proud, hardy people, independent. They respect genuine strength, not just the show of it. They will see you, and they will respect you." They would spit on me if they knew it, she thought, the old bitterness rising, but now it was directed inward, at her own ongoing, monstrous deception. They would see a ghost, a curse, not a queen. Her only solace, her only desperate act of penance, became the royal archives. It was a place of dust and deep silence, far from the prying, hostile eyes of the court. She began to spend her afternoons there, under the pretext of learning the official history of the kingdom she was now meant to help rule. In truth, she was a detective in her own tragedy, an archaeologist of her own annihilation, searching for any record, any fragment of parchment that spoke of the dawning sun not as a rival to be crushed, but as a kingdom that was, with laws, art, people, a heart. She found little at first. The official histories of Moonstone, penned by the victors, were meticulous in their portrayal of my ancestors as warmongers, tyrants, a blight that needed cleansing. But one afternoon, her fingers dusty and aching, she found a small, unmarked leather-bound journal tucked not on a shelf, but behind a loose stone at the base of a bookcase, as if hidden in haste. The script inside was elegant, flowing, a woman's hand. The journal fell from Sera's numb fingers, landing on the cold stone floor with a soft, final thud that echoed in the silent archive. It was all there, the devastating truth, the peace that was within grasp, brokered by two women who saw a different path. It wasn't a war of necessity, a defensive strike for survival. It was a preemptive massacre born of one man's paranoia, his bruised ego, and his discovery of his wife's act of compassion, which he branded as betrayal. Her family wasn't destroyed for the safety of Moonstone. They were destroyed because a king found a secret hope for peace and decided to murder it before it could take root. The guilt was now a physical, crushing weight, pressing the air from her lungs. She was living in the house of the man who had murdered peace itself, who had slaughtered a kingdom to punish a hope, and she was falling in love with his son, the boy whose soul his mother had tried so desperately to save from that very legacy. As she left the archives, her mind reeling, the world tilting on a new, horrifying axis, she nearly collided with a solid, familiar form in the dim corridor. "My lady," Torrin said, steadying her with a firm hand on her elbow. His sharp, perceptive eyes took in her pale, stricken face, the dust streaking her fingers, the shell-shocked look in her stormy eyes. "The archives are a lonely, cold place for a Luna. History can be a harsh companion. I find the past instructive," she managed to say, her voice thin and unsteady. "It helps one understand the present." Torrin held her gaze for a moment too long, his own eyes dark with suspicion and a dawning horrified comprehension. "The past can be a dangerous teacher, my lady. It often shows us only the reflections we wish to see, or the monsters we expect to find." He paused, his voice dropping to a low, urgent register. "The king plans to announce the northern tour at the full moon council in 3 days' time. His faith in you is absolute. It is the cornerstone of his plans, of his vision for a new kind of rule. It would shatter him, it would shatter everything, to discover that faith was misplaced, that the cornerstone was sand." He knew. He didn't know the specifics, the name, the history, but he knew she was hiding something monumental, a secret that could bring the entire kingdom down. His loyalty was to Darius, to the stability of the realm, and he was issuing a clear, final warning. The noose of suspicion was not just tightening, it was around her neck, and Torrin was on the rope. That evening, Darius found her on their now familiar balcony, staring out at the first evening stars as if seeking answers in their cold, distant light. He stood beside her, his silence a comfortable, solid thing she had begun, treacherously, to crave. "You are quiet lately," he observed, his voice a gentle rumble in the twilight. "The weight of the crown is heavy. I forget sometimes that you did not have a lifetime to grow accustomed to its burden." "It's not the crown," she whispered, the words torn from a place of deep, aching honesty. "It's the history it represents, the weight of all the stories that came before." He turned to her, his brow furrowed in thought. "What do you mean?" She looked at him, at the man who carried his own ghosts in the set of his shoulders, in the occasional shadow in his eyes, and the confession bubbled in her throat, desperate, screaming to be free. "My name is not Sera. I am Lyra, last of the dawning sun. Your father killed my family, not in a glorious war, but in a fit of rage over a pendant." But the words wouldn't come. They lodged behind the image of the terrified boy in her vision, behind the weeping words of Queen Lenore's journal, and behind the absolute trusting light in his eyes as he looked at her now. She saw the future he was building for them in his gaze, a future of partnership and perhaps even peace. And she couldn't do it. She couldn't be the one to extinguish that light, to replace it with the consuming fire of truth. Instead, she asked a question that had been burning inside her like a fever. "Do you ever wonder if the stories we're told about the past, the official histories, are true? All of them? Or if they are just the story the victors needed to tell?" Darius's expression grew somber, the starlight etching the hard lines of his face. He looked out over his sleeping kingdom, the lanterns twinkling like fallen stars. He said, "I know they are not," he quietly said, the admission costing him something. "I was there for the final one, the fall of the Sunfire Kingdom." The name was a curse on his lips, but his tone was weary, hollow, not triumphant. The official chronicles, the songs, they say it was a glorious, necessary victory against a savage, expansionist foe, a cleansing fire. I remember the silence afterwards, in that great hall. A silence so complete, so absolute, it felt like the world had lost its voice. There is no glory in that silence, only loss, a loss so vast it echoes. It was the closest he had ever come to acknowledging the horror, to divorcing himself from his father's narrative. In that moment, under the watchful stars, the last vestiges of her hatred melted away, not in forgiveness, but in a profound, shared grief. They were both children of a war they never asked for, heirs to a legacy of blood and silence, trying to find a way forward in the haunted dark. She reached out, her fingers gently, hesitantly, brushing against his where they rested on the cold stone balustrade. It was a small gesture, but it felt more intimate, more vulnerable than any embrace. He turned his hand, enveloping hers in his warm, strong grip, his calloused fingers closing over her slender ones. "I am sorry," she whispered, and she meant it with every fractured fiber of her being. Sorry for the boy he was forced to be, sorry for the lie she was living, sorry for the truth that would one day, inevitably, rise up like a leviathan from the deep and tear them and everything they were building apart. He lifted their joined hands, his eyes searching hers in the silver starlight, seeing the tears she could not suppress. "You have nothing to be sorry for. You are the one good thing, the one pure thing to come out of all that darkness. You are my peace, Sera." And as he said the words, with such devastating conviction, she knew with a sickening, soul-crushing certainty that she could never tell him. To reveal her secret now would not just be a betrayal of his trust, it would be an act of unimaginable cruelty, the destruction of the only peace he had ever allowed himself to hope for. She was trapped in a labyrinth of her own making, with no exit.
To love him was to lie to him. To tell him the truth was to destroy him. The weight of the crown was nothing, a feather, compared to the mountain of the secret she now knew she must carry, alone, to her grave. The full moon council arrived, and with it a tension that crackled in the air of the great hall like static before a devastating summer storm. The room was packed with every noble of significance, their faces a sea of anticipation, hostility, and avid curiosity. Darius stood before them on the dais, Sera seated in the smaller yet equally ornate throne beside his. It was the first time she had been formally seated as his equal in front of the entire gathered power of the kingdom. The throne felt like a block of ice, a seat of judgment. "My lords and ladies," Darius's voice rang out, clear and commanding, silencing the last of the murmurs. "The bonds of this kingdom are strengthened not only by law and shared strength, but by trust, by unity, and by the connection between the crown and all its people. To forge that connection beyond these walls, when the snows thaw and the passes clear, your Luna and I will embark on a tour of the northern provinces. It is time the heart of the crown was seen, was felt, in every corner of our land." A wave of reaction swept the room. Surprised nods, concerned frowns, calculating glances. But Lord Corvus rose slowly from his seat, his expression grave, the picture of paternal concern. "Your Majesty, with all due respect and the deepest loyalty, the northern borders remain unsettled, restless. The ghosts of the Sunfire Rebellion, the memories of that conflict still whisper in those mountain winds. Is it wise, is it prudent to expose our Luna, the very heart you speak of, to such potential, such undeniable danger?" "The Sunfire Rebellion was concluded a generation ago, Corvus," Darius replied, his voice cool, a direct rebuttal. "The people there are loyal subjects of Moonstone. It is precisely because of old whispers that we must go, to replace whispers with our presence, with truth." "Are they so loyal?" a new, honeyed voice interjected. All eyes turned to Lady Yassold, who rose with a graceful, poisonous elegance. "My king, we all admire your profound devotion to your Luna. It is a tale for the ages, but might your judgment in this matter be clouded by that very devotion? The North is wild, unpredictable. Its loyalties are to clan and chieftain first. And, if I may be so bold," she turned her chilling blue gaze directly on Sera, "our Luna herself seems unwell, so pale, so very quiet of late. The immense strain of her new position, the weight of such sudden elevation, must be a terrible burden. Perhaps a long, arduous tour, especially to such a raw and vigorous land, would be too much for her delicate constitution. The people might mistake her natural reticence for weakness, or worse, fear." It was a masterful, surgical attack, questioning both his strategic judgment and her fundamental strength and fitness to rule in one breath, all wrapped in a veil of faux concern. Sera felt the heat of 100 stares, a physical pressure. She saw the doubt blooming on their faces, the seeds Isolde had planted taking root. She was losing them, and in doing so, she was leeching credibility from Darius himself. Then a vision slammed into her, not of the past, not a warning of poison, but of the immediate, unfolding present. She saw, as if her consciousness had lifted from her body, a man in the crowd, a minor, forgettable lord from the northern territories named Valerius. She saw him, in perfect, horrifying detail, slip a hand inside his formal tunic, his fingers closing around the carved bone hilt of a slender dagger. The intent was as clear, as bright, as if he had shouted it to the rafters. He was not aiming for Darius. His eyes, in the vision, were locked on her. The blade was for her heart. The bond had given her a warning once more. But this was different. This was immediate, public, mortal. Her heart stopped, a frozen lump in her chest. She had a choice, split-second and devastating. She could stay silent, play the delicate, frail flower Isolde had just painted her to be, and hope against hope that Torin or the guards spotted the threat in the crowded, shifting room. Or she could act.
She could reveal a fraction of her impossible knowing and save herself, but at the cost of exposing the bond's terrifying depth, of painting a target of strangeness on her own back. As Darius opened his mouth, a storm gathering in his eyes to rebuke Isolde, Sera stood up. The movement was fluid, silent, and utterly commanding. Every single eye in the vast hall snapped to her. The silence became so profound, so heavy, she could hear the rustle of her own ground, the frantic beat of her own heart. She did not look at Isolde. She did not look at Darius. Her stormy gray eyes, usually so hesitant and downcast, were now clear, sharp, and cold as polished flint. They fixed directly, unerringly, on Lord Valerius, pinpointing him in the sea of faces. The man froze, his hands still hidden in the folds of his tunic. He was a hunter who had suddenly found himself the prey, pinned by the gaze of a creature whose nature he could not comprehend. The blood drained from his face, leaving it a sickly gray. "Lord Valerius," Sera said, and her voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of the hall with a strange, resonant clarity. It was not the voice of a servant girl or a nervous Omega. It was the voice of a queen, layered with a cool, ancient, unshakable authority that seemed to still the very air. The north wind is sharp this time of year, is it not? It chills one to the bone, makes the fingers clumsy, the grip uncertain. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze never wavering. It would be a profound, a tragic accident if a sudden, bitter draft in this hall caused you to lose your grip on what you were holding so tightly against your heart. A gasp, collective and sharp, rippled through the crowd. Confusion was on every face. What was she talking about? A draft? But Lord Valerius understood. He understood perfectly. The message was not about the weather.
It was a direct, undisguised threat and exposure. His eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He yanked his empty hand from his tunic as if the fabric itself had burst into flames, taking a stumbling, frantic step backward, his face a mask of guilt and panic. In an instant, before anyone else could even process the strange exchange, Torin was moving. He and 2 guards were on Valerius, disarming him, pulling the dagger from his grip, and dragging the struggling, babbling man from the hall. The glint of the blade in the torchlight was all the confirmation the stunned assembly needed. The room erupted into chaos, shouts, questions, cries of alarm. But Darius was not looking at the commotion. He was staring at Sera, who had slowly sat back down, her composure icy. His expression was one of pure, unadulterated shock, his kingly mask completely shattered. How could she have known? The man had given no outward indication, made no aggressive move. He had been still in the crowd. She had seen a threat no one else could see, a intention hidden in a man's heart. Isolde's face was a picture of furious, baffled defeat, her plan unraveling in the most public and inexplicable way possible. Sera had not just defended herself from verbal barbs, she had demonstrated a power that defied explanation, a connection to something beyond their understanding, something that looked like witchcraft or divine favor. The court feared both in equal measure. Ilara slowly sat back down, her body beginning to tremble now that the adrenaline was fading, the reaction setting in. She had done it. She had revealed a fraction of her strange, bond-given ability to save her own life, and in doing so, she had cemented a terrifying, awe-inspiring authority in a way no pretty speech or act of charity ever could. But as she met Darius's stunned, deeply searching gaze, she knew the cost was catastrophic. The ghost of her past was no longer whispering in the garden or weeping in the archives. It was here, in the throne room, wearing her face and speaking with her voice. She had just given it a voice, and now everyone had heard it. The question in Darius's eyes was blindingly clear, a silent thunderclap. Who are you? And for the first time, staring into those stormy, shocked depths, she was truly, bone-deep terrified that he was beginning to see the answer. The council chamber emptied in a hushed, frantic whisper, a river of silk and shock flowing out the doors.
The story of the Luna's uncanny, impossible perception would be on every tongue in the kingdom before nightfall, growing in the telling. Sera sat perfectly still on her throne, feeling the weight of Darius's gaze like a physical anchor, holding her in place, demanding answers. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, from hidden fear to public, terrifying power. He did not speak until the last elder had scurried out, the great doors thudding shut with a sound of finality, leaving them in a silence that was louder, more accusing than any uproar. Torin was the first to move, his face a mask of grim, efficient fury. I will oversee the interrogation of Lord Valerius personally. He will talk or he will break. He gave Sera a long, piercing look that held no warmth, only a dawning, horrific comprehension, before bowing stiffly and striding out, leaving her alone with the king. Darius rose from his throne, the movement slow, deliberate, charged with a potent, silent energy. He did not approach her immediately. He simply stood there, his silver eyes tracing the lines of her face, her hands, as if seeing her for the first time, examining a stranger, a puzzle that had suddenly rearranged itself into a threatening shape. Explain. The word was soft, barely a breath, but it carried the force of a royal decree, the weight of a mountain. Sera's mind raced, a frantic bird beating against the iron bars of her cage. The lie about smelling poison was flimsy, child's play. It would not hold here, not against this. I saw it in his eyes, she whispered, the half-truth tasting like dust and failure. The intent to harm, it was so clear, so bright. His eyes were hidden in the crowd, Darius countered, his voice dangerously calm, a flat lake over unseen depths. The man who moved toward you, I was watching him. I saw nothing, no tension in his shoulders, no shift in his stance. My own beta, trained from birth to spot assassins from 100 paces in a moving throng, saw nothing. But you, from across the room, seated, you saw not just his intent, but the specific weapon he had not yet drawn from his hiding place. He took a step closer, his presence filling the space between them. How, Sera? Tears of frustration, of fear, of the immense burden welled in her eyes. I don't know. I just knew. It was the most honest, the most terrifying thing she had said to him, a confession of her own ignorance in the face of the impossible. He knelt before her throne, bringing his eyes level with hers, abandoning his height, his kingship, in a gesture of raw, desperate need for understanding. The power that radiated from him was not threatening, but probing, intense, a searchlight in the dark. These sensitivities of yours, this knowledge, it is more than just instinct. It is profound. I have felt it too, a pull, a connection so deep it feels as though it reaches into the very chambers of my own mind, rearranging the furniture. He searched her face, his own a landscape of confusion and dawning, world-altering realization. At the ceremony, when you walked in, I felt a piercing pain. I saw a flash of a banner, a radiant sun, the banner of the dawning sun. Sera's blood ran cold, freezing in her veins. She stopped breathing. I dismissed it, he continued, his voice dropping to a hushed, intimate tone, as if sharing a sacred, terrifying secret. But it has happened since. Fleeting images, feelings that are not my own, a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow when you look at the dawnstar blooms, a jolt of pure cold fear when Isolde is near, a phantom scent of smoke sometimes when you're distressed. He reached out, his fingers hovering just beside her temple, not touching her, but feeling the energy there. It's you, isn't it? The bond, it is not just a feeling, it is a bridge. It is showing me your thoughts, your fears, your memories. This was her chance. This was the moment to confess, to unburden her soul under the guise of this miraculous, frightening, faded connection. To say, yes, it is my pain you feel, my memories you see, because I am Lyra of the dawning sun.
But the words stuck in her throat, choked by the image of the terrified boy in her vision.
by the weeping words of Queen Lenore's journal, by the devastating knowledge of what the full, unvarnished truth would do to him, to the man, not just the king. "Is that what it is?" she breathed, her voice trembling like a plucked string. She leaned into his narrative, the safer, still miraculous lie. "Are our minds becoming one? Is the bond so deep it shares our souls?" He let out a long, slow breath, the rigid line of suspicion in his jaw softening, his shoulders relaxing marginally. It was an explanation he could accept, a testament to the unparalleled power of their destined bond, something sacred, mystical and awe-inspiring. It was a more palatable truth than the one screaming in her own heart, the truth of blood and history. "It must be," he murmured, his hand finally cupping her cheek, his thumb wiping away a stray, traitorous tear. "The moon goddess has woven our souls together more tightly, more intricately than I ever dared dream possible." He looked at her with a new kind of awe, a reverence that was somehow more terrifying than his suspicion had been. "You are a miracle, Sera. You see the shadows that stalk me when I am blinded by light. You feel the daggers in the dark. You are not just my Luna. You are my shield, my living, breathing, destined shield." He believed the bond was giving her glimpses of his world, of the threats arrayed against him. He had constructed a beautiful, convenient, and heartbreaking truth to explain the impossible. He saw her as his protector, his guardian angel. The guilt was a physical sickness, rising in her throat. She was using the very thing that betrayed her, their profound, inescapable connection, to deepen his trust, to weave her deception even tighter, more intimately. She was his shield, all right, a shield hiding the blade of her own identity, poised eternally at his back. "I will always protect you, Darius," she whispered, and the words were the most truthful and the most deceitful thing she had ever uttered. She would protect him from physical harm, yes, but she was also protecting him from the truth that would shatter him, and in doing so, she was ensuring her own betrayal fester and grew. He helped her to her feet, his arm a solid, supportive band around her waist. "Then, the northern tour will proceed. With you by my side, seeing what I cannot, I fear nothing. Together we are more than king and queen. We are a force of nature." As they walked from the chamber, Sera felt a vital piece of her soul wither and die, crumbling to ash. She had survived the confrontation, navigated the deadly waters, but she had lost something irreplaceable in the process. Her secret was no longer a passive burden she carried. It was now an active, twisting, corrupting force within the most beautiful, sacred thing in her life. And with every beat of his trusting heart against hers, with every look of odd reliance he gave her, the corruption spread its dark roots deeper, threatening to poison the very bond that sustained it. The following days were a study in surreal, heightened tension. Darius's new absolute belief in their preternatural, psychic bond made him more attentive, more open, in a way that was both a blessing and a curse. He would share his deepest thoughts on statecraft, his private worries about border tensions and economic strains, and then watch her intently, as if she was waiting to receive a vision, a divine insight that would solve all his problems. The pressure was immense, a constant silent demand for a miracle she could not perform on command. She was not an oracle. She was a traumatized girl receiving terrifying, unpredictable flashes of a past that was not hers to share. Meanwhile, Torrhen's interrogation of Lord Valerius yielded a frustrating, predictable dead end. The Lord, a man of fading influence and mounting secret debts, confessed only to being paid a substantial sum of gold by a hooded intermediary in a dark tavern. The description he gave could have fit any number of courtiers or their agents. The dagger was untraceable, a common blade from a northern smithy. The mastermind, undoubtedly Isolde or someone in her circle, remained shrouded in careful deniability. But the attempt had a chilling, clarifying effect. The open, sneering hostility from the court diminished, replaced by a wary, superstitious fear. They no longer saw a weak, upstart Omega. They saw a seer, a woman touched by the moon goddess in strange, unknowable ways. They bowed lower, their eyes averted not in respect, but in primal fear of the uncanny. Their whispers fell completely silent as she passed, as if she could hear their thoughts. It was a victory of sorts, a shield of fear, but it isolated her further, made her a figure of awe and dread, not love or acceptance. She was alone on an island of strange power. It was during a lesson on the kingdom's heraldry, in the quiet of their chambers, that the web of her existence tightened another, more personal notch. Darius was showing her the great roles of noble houses, pointing out the symbols of the major families: wolves, mountains, crossed swords, phases of the moon. And this, he said, his voice turning somber as he unrolled a final, smaller scroll. The parchment was discolored at the edges, slightly burnt. He smoothed the parchment. It showed the radiant, stylized sun on its crimson field, but the artistry was different from the one in the hidden portrait. This version was sharper, more aggressive, the rays like jagged spear points. They were a fierce, proud people, he said, his voice neutral, detached. The voice of a historian. The chronicles say their king in the final days was a tyrant, a madman who threatened the peace of the entire continent. But he paused, looking at the banner with a frown. My mother's private writings, which I found after her passing, suggested otherwise. She believed the last king desired peace, that he was a man trapped by the pride of his ancestors. It is a strange, disorienting thing to discover the history you were taught, the history that justifies your very crown, may be incomplete, a lie by omission. Sera could only nod, her throat too tight, too dry, for speech. He was sharing his own deepest doubts with her, unknowingly handing her the keys to her own prison, offering her the tools of her own potential liberation or destruction.
He rolled the scroll back up with care. We keep this not as a trophy, not as a symbol of a conquered foe. We keep it as a reminder of the terrible cost of failed understanding, of the price paid when dialogue dies before the first sword is drawn. He placed it back in its carved wooden case. The tour will include a stop at the ruins of their capital, Sunstone. It was said to be a city of light, of scholars and artisans. It is now a monument to the absolute folly of war, to what is lost when we choose destruction over discourse. I want you to see it. I want us to remember it together, to pledge on those scarred stones that our reign will be different. The world tilted, the floor seeming to fall away beneath her feet. Sunstone. The name was a bell tolling in the deepest, most sacred chambers of her soul, a funeral dirge, the place of her birth, the cradle of her childhood, the tomb of her family, her people, her world. He was going to take her to the mass grave of her ancestors and ask her to mourn the folly of war with him, to make a pledge on their bones. The grotesque, horrifying irony of it was a blow to the stomach, enough to make her physically, violently ill. She excused herself, pleading a sudden crippling headache, which was not a lie, and fled to the only sanctuary she had, the gardens. She stumbled down a hidden, overgrown path, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The
the weight of it all crushing down on her, the walls of her gilded, loving cage closing in. She collapsed onto a secluded moss-covered stone bench, burying her face in her hands, her body racked with silent, heaving sobs. A soft, deliberate crunch of gravel under a slipper made her look up, her heart leaping into her throat. Lady Isolde stood there, her expression not one of gloating triumph, but of cold, intense, calculated curiosity, like a scientist examining a fascinating, dangerous specimen. "The ruins of Sunstone," Isolde said softly, as if reading the torment in Sera's mind. "A poignant, indeed a poetic pilgrimage for our new Luna, a journey to the heart of darkness to appreciate the light you now stand in." She took a delicate step closer, though I cannot help but wonder what ghosts will be waiting there for you, specifically. What memories will those stones hold that the history books do not hold? Sera stared at her, too raw, too exhausted, too emotionally flayed to dissemble. "What do you want from me, Isolde? What will it take for you to leave me be?" She smiled, a thin, bloodless curve of her lips. "I want to understand the puzzle, little Omega. The great Alpha King, who could have had any pure-blooded, powerful, politically advantageous alpha female in the realm, chooses a nameless, powerless servant. This servant then displays an uncanny, almost unnatural sense of perception, avoiding traps and spotting assassins with no training. She shows a deep, personal, soul-wrenching melancholy at the sight of simple flowers. And now she looks as if she has seen the face of death itself at the mere mention of a pile of old rubble. You are hiding something far more interesting, far more potent than just a common, low-born history. You are a story waiting to be read, and I have always been an excellent reader." "You have no proof of anything," Sera whispered, the defiance weak, tremulous. "Proof is for courts of law and simple-minded kings," Isolde hissed, her eyes glittering with predatory promise. "I deal in suspicion, in patterns, in the scent of fear that is not just about status, but about identity. And I am not the only one who is suspicious, who sees the patterns. The king may be blinded by this bond, drunk on its mystery, but others have clearer eyes. Torin watches, Corvus watches. We are all waiting, with bated breath, for you to make a mistake, to let the mask slip for just 1 second. And when you do, I will be there. I will be the first to peel back every layer of your careful deception until everyone, including your beloved, blinded king, sees the rotten truth you are so desperately hiding." She turned and glided away, disappearing into the dappled shadows of the garden, leaving Sera alone in the gathering twilight, more trapped, more terrified, and more utterly alone than ever before. The palace became a whirlwind of purposeful activity, a hive preparing for the monumental northern tour. Armor was polished to a mirror shine, the royal carriages were checked and reinforced, provisions for a weeks-long journey were packed with meticulous care. For Sera, watching the frantic preparations felt like observing the assembly of her own funeral procession. Every trunk packed was another step closer to Sunstone, another step closer to the ghosts that lived in her blood and screamed her true name with every beat of her heart. Darius, however, was invigorated, transformed. He saw this not as a simple royal progress, but as their first true campaign as partners, a chance to solidify their rule beyond the gilded, poisonous cage of the capital, to write their own story in the wild, fresh air of the provinces. His trust in her, forged in the fire of the assassination attempt and tempered by his belief in their psychic bond, was now absolute, unshakable. He included her in every strategic meeting with his commanders and stewards, his belief in her intuition, making him value her quiet suggestions above the loud advice of seasoned advisors. "The northern lords are a stubborn, independent breed," he explained to her one evening in the war room, maps of mountain passes and river valleys spread across the large oak table. "They respect strength, yes, but they value honesty, integrity, and action, above flowery words or display of force from me. Your quiet dignity, Sera, your genuine compassion, it will speak louder to them than any grand speech or display of force from me. They will see you, and through you, they will see the king I am trying to be."
She nodded silently, her eyes tracing the familiar, aching lines of the mountain ranges and river valleys on the parchment. These were not just lines on a map. They were the bones of her homeland, the veins of her lost kingdom. She knew these passes in the dead of winter, knew which valleys flooded with the spring thaw, which meadows bloomed with dawn star blooms. Knowledge she should not possess. Knowledge that was a silent scream of her identity. Torin, ever present at these meetings, watched her. His silence was more accusing than any words. He had found no concrete link between Lord Valerius and Isolde, but he had not stopped searching, his mind tirelessly working the puzzle that was Sera. His loyalty was a blade forever pointed at the perceived threat to his king, and Sera could feel its sharp edge aimed at her heart every single day. The night before their departure, as if the heavens themselves protested the journey, a great storm rolled in from the northern mountains. The wind howled around the castle's spires like a chorus of lost souls, a lonely, mournful sound that kept Sera awake, staring at the ceiling. She slipped from her bed, drawn to the window, watching the lightning illuminate the tortured, cloud-ravaged sky in bursts of stark white. It felt like an omen, a warning written in light and thunder. She felt him before she heard him. Darius stood in the doorway connecting their chambers, a broad silhouette against the low, dancing firelight from his room. "You should be sleeping," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble that competed with the thunder outside. "So should you," she replied, not turning around, her voice barely audible over the storm. He came to stand beside her at the window, his presence a solid warmth in the cool room. "The north wind carries many voices on a night like this," he murmured, watching the lightning split the sky. "My father always said it whispered the secrets of the fallen, the regrets of the dead." He was quiet for a long moment, the storm reflecting in his eyes. "Does it speak to you? Can you hear them?" Her breath hitched. What would they say? Truths, perhaps, or warnings, pleas for remembrance, or for vengeance. He turned to look at her, his face half in shadow, half lit by a sudden flash of lightning. "This bond between us, it shows you things. Before the council, you felt Lord Valerius's intent as clearly as if he had shouted it. Have you felt anything else? Anything about the north? About Sunstone?" His gaze was intense, probing, but not suspicious, searching for guidance, for a sign. This was it, a direct question, a chance to plant a seed of warning, to prepare him, to give a piece of the truth wrapped in the mystery of the bond. The words trembled on her lips, desperate to be free. "I feel a sorrow so deep it has no bottom. I see a city of golden light, and then I see it consumed by an endless night. I hear children laughing, and then I hear only silence.
But the confession stuck in her throat, too dangerous, too revealing, a crack that could split the world open. "I feel a coldness," she whispered, which was not a lie. It was the cold of the grave, of memory. A deep and ancient coldness emanating from that place, a sadness in the stone. He nodded slowly, as if this confirmed something he had already sensed in his own soul. "The cold of a forgotten grave," he said grimly. "We will warm it with remembrance, with acknowledgement, and then we will leave it to its peace, having paid our respects to the past so we may build the future." The following morning, under a sky scrubbed clean and painfully bright by the storm, the royal procession departed. The people of the capital lined the streets, cheering for their king and the mysterious seer Luna who had saved him from hidden daggers. Sera sat in the ornate, cushioned carriage beside Darius, her hand clasped in his, waving at the blur of hopeful, curious faces. She felt like the ultimate imposter on a victory parade, rolling in comfort toward the scene of her own utter defeat, toward the open wound of her past. The further north they traveled, the more the land changed, asserting its true character. The soft, rolling hills and fertile fields of central Moonstone gave way to ragged, snow-dusted peaks, deep, pine-scented valleys where mist clung to the trees, and rushing, ice-cold rivers. The air grew sharper, thinner, tasting of stone and freedom. It was a landscape of harsh, unforgiving beauty and stark, undeniable truth. It was home, a home that no longer knew her name. She found herself pointing out landmarks to Darius without thinking, the knowledge rising from a place deeper than memory, as instinctive as breathing. That ridge, the one shaped like a wolf's head, the local shepherds use it to spot the first early snows from the west. Or, the river is running unusually high for this season. The mountain snowmelt must be heavy. The lower passes might be treacherous, flooded. Darius would look at her, a faint, curious frown of surprise etching his brow. "You know these lands? Their ways? I did not think the archives held such specific, practical knowledge of the northern reaches." She would freeze, her heart lurching into her throat, panic a cold splash. I must have read it in one of the old travel logs," she stammered, the lie sounding more feeble, more transparent each time she used it. "Or perhaps the bond shows me glimpses of the land through your own knowledge," she ventured once, desperately trying to steer the narrative back to safe mystical ground. But the excuse was wearing thin. Torrin, riding steadfastly alongside the carriage, heard every exchange. His suspicious, watchful gaze was a constant, heavy weight adding to the burden of the mountains themselves. On the third day, they stopped at a fortified town nestled in a high, remote valley, a place of hardy, self-sufficient people. The townsfolk here were different, taller, leaner, their faces weathered by wind and work, their eyes holding a wary, assessing intelligence. They bowed to Darius with a respect that was earned, not given freely, but their primary attention was fixed, unwaveringly, on Sera. They stared at her gray eyes, her honey-colored hair, her bearing with a strange, unsettling intensity that was more than curiosity. It was recognition, searching and confused. That night in the hall of the local chieftain, an old woman wrapped in faded, patched woolens, a village elder known for her wisdom and her visions, approached the high table. She ignored the king completely, her milky, sightless eyes seeming to see through to Sera's very soul. She reached out a gnarled, trembling hand, not to touch, but to gesture vaguely at Sera's face.
"The storm in the eyes," the old woman croaked, her voice like stones grinding together in a dry riverbed. A profound silence fell over the hall. "The blood of the mountain runs true, even in silence, even in borrowed robes. She then placed a single, freshly picked, vibrant dawn star bloom on the table directly in front of Sera, turned without another word, and shuffled away, leaving a void of stunned silence behind her. The hall erupted into a chaos of whispers. The local chieftain looked horrified, apologetic, and deeply confused. Darius was on his feet in an instant, his expression thunderous, his alpha power beginning to coil in the air. Sera sat frozen, a statue of dread, staring at the radiant orange flower. The blood of the mountain. It was an old, almost forgotten saying of the Dawning Sun people, a phrase reserved for the royal line, denoting their deep, intrinsic connection to the land. This old woman, in front of the king, his beta, and all the northern nobles, had not just recognized her as one of their own, she had named her as royalty. She had seen the ghost beneath the skin. The web of her deception, stretched taut and fragile by the journey, by the familiar landscape, had just been plucked by a blind seer, and the vibration, the shock wave of that single phrase was felt by everyone in the room. Darius's confused, dawning fury, Torin's sudden, horrified comprehension as the pieces finally clicked into a terrible, impossible picture. The whispers of the northerners, shifting from curiosity to awe, to fear, to a kind of frantic hope. The secret was no longer a silent, internal burden. It was a living, breathing entity in the room with them, and in the echoing silence after the old woman's words, it had just spoken its true, forbidden name. The atmosphere in the traveling camp the next morning was thick, frozen, charged with a tension more brittle than the morning frost on the grass. The easy camaraderie of the journey was gone, replaced by a wary, watchful silence. Darius had dismissed the feast immediately the night before, his grip on Sera's arm not protective, but possessive and unyielding, as he led her to their allotted chambers in the fort. He did not speak, but the storm of emotions rolling off him, confusion, betrayal, fury, was a palpable, suffocating force. Once the door was closed, he released her, turning to face her with a look of bewildered, gut-wrenching fury. What was that, Sera? The blood of the mountain. What in the name of the goddess does that mean? His voice was low, strained, each word carefully measured to avoid shattering. She wrapped her arms around herself, retreating into the familiar, useless posture of the timid Omega, but the act felt hollow now, a torn curtain. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice breaking. "She was an old woman. She is blind. She was confused, speaking in riddles." "Was she?" Darius's voice was a dangerous, quiet rasp. "Because the chieftain just spent an hour explaining to me that the blood of the mountain is an ancient, sacred saying of the Dawning Sun people, a phrase used exclusively for their royal line, denoting a connection to the land so deep it was in their very blood." He took a step closer, his silver eyes blazing with hurt and confusion that cut deeper than any anger. "You have been strange, distant since we entered these lands. You know things you should not. You speak of these mountains, these rivers, as if you were born to them, as if you have walked them in another life. And now this." He ran a hand through his dark hair, a gesture of pure, agonizing frustration. "I have defended you against every accusation, Sera. I have built my faith, the future of my kingdom, on the bedrock of our bond, of who I believed you to be. Do not let it be quicksand. Do not let me drown in it." He turned and left the room, the door closing with a soft, final click that echoed in her soul. She sank to the floor, the cold stone seeping through her gown, matching the ice in her veins.
It was over. The fragile, beautiful illusion was shattered. Torrin would be piecing it together now, the strange knowledge, the flowers, the phrase. It was only a matter of miles before the full truth was undeniable. The next leg of the journey was undertaken in a heavy, suffocating silence. Darius rode his massive black stallion at the head of the column, no longer sharing the carriage with her, a king distancing himself from a troubling mystery. Torrin's watchful presence was no longer discreet surveillance. It was an open, grim guard, his eyes constantly on her, a jailer watching her most dangerous prisoner. The northerners they passed on the road no longer stared with simple curiosity. They looked at her with a strange, simmering recognition that made her skin crawl, a mixture of awe, fear, and a desperate, hidden hope she could not bear. And then they crested a final high pass, and they saw it. The ruins of Sunstone lay spread in the valley below like the bleached bones of a colossal beast. The sight stole the air from Sera's lungs, a physical blow. It was not just a city. It was a skeleton picked clean by time and vultures. The famed white gold walls, which had once gleamed so brightly they could be seen for miles, were blackened with soot, cracked and broken. The great palace, where she had played hide-and-seek in sun-drenched halls, was a jagged, broken outline against the piercing blue sky, a child's drawing of a crown snapped in half. The city of light, of her earliest memories, was a grave of shadows and silence. A low, pained sound, almost a groan, escaped Darius. He had seen paintings, heard descriptions, but the reality of the destruction, the sheer, brutal scale of it, was visceral, horrifying. By the goddess, he breathed, his voice hushed with a kind of holy dread. It was immense. A world.
They rode down in a silence deeper than any they had known, the only sounds the crunch of hooves on scree and the mournful cry of a distant hawk. As they entered the outskirts of the city, the silence deepened, becoming a physical presence. Nature was reclaiming the stone, but slowly, reluctantly. Vines crawled over shattered homes like hesitant green shrouds. Trees grew through collapsed roofs, their roots cradling the bones of buildings. It was a place of profound, aching peace and profound, unspeakable sorrow. Darius dismounted, his movements heavy, as if the weight of the past was a tangible burden on his shoulders. He walked toward the gaping maw that had once been the great palace, drawn by a morbid, gravitational pull. Sera followed, her legs weak, trembling, every step a pilgrimage through a museum of her own nightmares, each broken stone a chapter in the story of her death. He stopped in what had once been the heart of the palace, the throne room. The roof was gone, open to the vast, uncaring sky. The elements had long since worn away the blood and soot, leaving only scarred, pale stone gleaming in the sunlight, clean and cruel. "My father," Darius's voice was hollow, echoing in the vast empty space, a confession to the wind. "He told me this was a nest of vipers, that he had purified the land, saved our people from a creeping darkness." He looked around, his face ashen, his eyes seeing not a victory, but a crime scene. This is not purification. This is annihilation. This is murder on a scale that steals the soul. Sera stood beside him, tears streaming silently, endlessly down her face. She could almost hear the echoes, the laughter of courtiers, the strain of a lute from the minstrel's gallery, her mother's gentle voice, and then the rising chorus of the final screams, the clash of steel, her father's shouted commands being cut short. Darius turned to her, his own eyes bright with unshed tears, his kingly composure stripped bare by the naked horror of the place. "Why do you weep, Sera?" he asked, his voice raw, scraped thin by emotion. "Why does this place grieve you so? What is this coldness you feel?" Is it just the shadow of history, or is it memory? It was the moment. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, the very stones waiting. The chasm between them was here, in this ruined throne room. She opened her mouth, the confession finally, after a lifetime of hiding, rising to her lips. The truth would out. It had to. But before the first syllable could form, Torin called out, his voice sharp, urgent, and thick with a horror that had nothing to do with ancient stones, from across the overgrown courtyard. "Your Majesty, you need to see this, now." They found him standing before a half-collapsed wall that had been part of an inner chamber that he had cleared away with a thick mat of ivy with his own hands, revealing a section of a faded but miraculously preserved mural that had been protected from the worst of the elements by the fallen roof. It depicted a royal family, a king with a kind, strong face in a crown of intertwined golden oak leaves, a queen with eyes the color of a misty morning and a gentle smile, and between them, sitting on the queen's lap, a little girl, a girl no more than 4 or 5 years old, with unruly honey-colored hair and eyes the exact, distinctive shade of a storm-washed sky. She was clutching a wooden doll, and the artist had captured her features, the slight, mischievous tilt of her smile, with stunning, heartbreaking clarity. They were her eyes. They were her smile. They were the face she saw in her own rare, fragmented memories. Torin pointed a trembling finger from the painted child's face to Sera's living, tear-streaked one, his voice a hoarse, horrified whisper that carried in the dead air, "By all the gods, Darius, look!" Darius' gaze snapped from the vibrant, lifelike painting to the woman standing beside him, covered in the dust of his journey, her face a mirror of the child. The confusion, the suspicion, the fragmented memories from the bond, the old woman's words, Sera's strange knowledge, it all crashed together in that single suspended moment into one horrifying, impossible, world-shattering conclusion. His silver eyes widened in dawning, absolute terror, not of her, but of the truth. He took a stumbling step back, his hand going to the hilt of his sword, not in threat, but in a blind need for something solid, something real, as the entire foundation of his reality dissolved into ash around him. "Sera?" he whispered, her name a question, a plea, a curse that hung in the air between them. "What have you done? Who are you?" The ghost was no longer an echo in the garden, a whisper in the archive, a feeling in the bond. It was standing right in front of him, in the ruins of its own kingdom, wearing the face of the woman he loved, and its name was written on the wall in paint and blood. The silence in the ruined throne room was more deafening than any battle cry, more final than any executioner's stroke. It was the sound of a world breaking, of a future disintegrating into dust. Darius stood frozen, a statue of shock, his hands still clenched around the hilt of his sword, his knuckles white. His gaze was locked on Sera, but he was no longer seeing the quiet, mysterious Omega he had claimed as his Luna, the woman he had believed was his destined shield. He was seeing the ghost from the mural, the princess from the banned stories, the daughter of the king his father had murdered in this very room, the daughter who should be dead. "Sera," he repeated, the name now a foreign, bitter thing on his tongue. "Is that even your name?" The pretense was over. The walls had crumbled to dust around her, as surely as the stones of sunstone. A strange, terrifying calm descended on her, the calm of the doomed, of those who have nothing left to lose. The weight of the lie was gone, lifted. All that remained was the devastating, naked truth, and a grief so vast it was a new kind of silence. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, no longer a whisper. It was the voice of a princess, reclaiming her throne of rubble and memory. "No, my name is Lyra, Lyra of the House of the Dawning Sun, daughter of King Theron and Queen Laurel, the last of my line, the child in that painting."
Rylan drew his sword in a single fluid motion, the ring of steel unnaturally loud in the quiet, his face a mask of furious, betrayed loyalty. But Darius threw out a hand, a sharp, commanding gesture, stopping him dead. He was still staring at Lyra, at Sera, his mind visibly, painfully trying to bridge the impossible chasm between the woman he loved and the living relic of his father's greatest, most unforgivable sin. How? The word was ripped from him, ragged and pained, the question of a man whose history has just been rewritten. The massacre, the reports, the pyres, they said no one survived, not a soul. "A servant," she said, her stormy eyes holding his, no longer hiding their ancient, bottomless grief. "My nurse, Anya. She smuggled me out in a laundry cart, wrapped in bloody linens, hidden among the dead. She raised me as her own daughter, a scullery maid in the palace of the king who destroyed my world." A bitter, broken smile touched her lips, a crack in her composure. The ultimate hiding place, the last place anyone would look for a sunfire princess. The moon goddess has a vicious, poetic sense of humor, does she not? Darius flinched as if struck. The bond, the pain he felt at the ceremony, the visions of the sun banner, the profound sorrow he sensed in her, the strange knowledge, it all made a terrible, horrifying, perfect sense. The moon goddess had not been blessing him, she had been torturing him, binding him irrevocably to the living embodiment of his family's crime, to a walking, breathing indictment of his crown. "You knew," he breathed, the betrayal slicing deeper than any physical blade, poisoning the well of their every memory. "You stood beside me. You let me touch you. You let me love you, all while knowing I was the son of the man who slaughtered your family, who burned your home." Love? The word was a sob that she forced into a sharp, painful laugh, a sound of pure anguish. "What choice did I have, Darius? Should I have thrown myself at your feet that first night and said, 'Hello, my destined mate. Your father killed my parents and reduced my world to ash. Shall we discuss the menu?' You would have had my head on a spike before the moon reached its zenith. Or worse, you would have handed me to Corvus and Isolde for their sport. You think I would have, what, spared me?" she cried, the calm shattering, all the fear and pain and fury of a lifetime, of a murdered kingdom, erupting in a torrent. The son of Alistair the Butcher, the heir to the throne of lies and blood built on the bones of my people. You were raised on stories of our savagery, our madness. You were here. You stood in the ashes of my home in this very spot and learned the price of defiance. You were your father's lesson. The memory, her memory from the bond vision, humming between them, a shared, horrific phantom. Darius recoiled, the color draining completely from his face, leaving him gray. "You saw that? In the bond?" "I see everything," she screamed, the power of the bond, of her truth finally, fully unleashed, a dam breaking. "I feel everything. I felt your horror that night, your childish confusion. I felt your shame. I feel the weight of your crown and the ghost of your mother's hope for peace. Our souls are tangled in this blood-soaked history, knotted in a tragedy we never asked for. And you have the gall, the privilege, to feel betrayed? You feel betrayed by the victim?" She was trembling violently, her body vibrating with the force of her confession, with the release of a lifetime of silence.
Torrhen stood poised, his sword still drawn, his eyes darting between his shattered king and the revealed, furious princess, awaiting a command, any command, to make sense of the madness. But Darius was crumbling. The foundation of his entire life, his father's legacy as a strong, necessary unifier, his own righteousness, the divine purity and purpose of his bond, was collapsing into the open grave at his feet. He looked from Laura's tear-streaked, defiant, agonized face to the kind, painted eyes of the queen on the wall, to the innocent face of the little girl who had lost everything, who had been hiding in his own kitchen. His hand fell from his sword, the weapon suddenly meaningless. He took a staggering step back, his legs unable to hold the weight of the truth. He sank to his knees on the broken, sun-warmed stone amidst the ruins of her kingdom and the ruins of the love he thought they had. His shoulders slumped, his head bowing, the mighty Alpha King brought low not by an enemy army, but by the devastating, unanswerable weight of the past. A single ragged, gut-wrenching sob tore from his throat. It was the sound of a king breaking, of a man seeing the monster in his own lineage and the innocent caught in its jaws. "I didn't know," he whispered to the stones, his voice thick with an agony so profound it was physical. "By the goddess Lyra, I didn't know. I was a child. He told me it was justice, a hard necessity." Lyra stood above him, the last daughter of the dawning sun, watching the Alpha King brought to his knees, not by her hand, but by the devastating gravity of the truth. The fury drained out of her, leaving only an immense, hollow exhaustion, a wasteland of spent emotion. She had wanted him to hurt, to understand the depth of her pain, but seeing him like this, shattered, lost, a boy again in the ruins of his father's sin, brought no victory, no satisfaction. Only a deeper, more profound, more shared sorrow. They were both orphans of the same war. Torrhen slowly, hesitantly lowered his sword, the fight gone out of him, replaced by a stunned, weary comprehension. The enemy was not a foreign power or a rival alpha. The enemy was history. The enemy was in the blood of the king he served and in the veins of the woman he was sworn to protect. Darius looked up, his silver eyes ravaged, filled with a grief so deep it seemed bottomless, a well of regret. "All this time, I was trying to build a future with you. I was planning a life, a kingdom of peace, on the grave of your past, on the bones of your family." Lyra hugged herself, the cold of the ruins, of the truth finally seeping into her bones, a permanent chill. "Yes," she said, softly, the fight gone from her voice, leaving only a bleak, accepted reality. "And now you understand why it could never hold. Why it was always just a beautiful, painful dream built on a foundation of sand and ash."
The truth was out. The secret was free, howling in the wind through the broken palace. But as they stood in the skeleton of her city, the king on his knees in penance, the princess standing in her grief, the beta in his shock, it was clear that the revelation was not an end. It was a cataclysm. The landscape of their lives had been permanently, violently altered, and they were now standing together in the terrifying, silent, smoking aftermath, with no map, no guide, no idea how to take a single step forward through the wreckage. The journey back to the Moonstone capital was a funeral procession without a body, without a casket, just the heavy, rotting corpse of the truth carried between them all. The royal carriage felt like a prison cell, the plush cushions now instruments of torture. Darius and Lyra sat on opposite benches, a chasm of ruined history, betrayal, and shattered love between them. He did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on the passing, blurring landscape, but she knew he saw nothing but the ruins of Sunstone and the ghost of his father's raised sword. Rylan rode closer to the carriage than ever before, his usual vigilance now a grim, sorrowful guard duty. The secret was contained, for now, among the three of them. The soldiers and servants saw only a king and queen locked in a terrible, silent, world-ending quarrel. They whispered of the depressing ruins, of the strange, tense northerners, but they did not guess, could not imagine the earth-shattering truth that sat like a third passenger in the carriage. When they finally arrived at the gleaming spires of the Moonstone Palace, it felt alien to Lyra, a gilded cage she had escaped only to be captured anew. The gilded halls that had once been her prison of performance now felt like a stage after the final tragic act had been performed, the audience gone home, the lights dimmed. The performance was over. She was no longer playing the part of Sera. She was Lyra, a princess in exile, a prisoner of war in the most luxurious of dungeons, a ghost who had been forced to remember it had a body. Darius vanished into his war room the moment they arrived, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him with a sound of finality. He did not summon her. He did not send for her. He disappeared into the fortress of his duty and his pain. Lyra retreated to the chambers that were no longer hers, that had never been hers. Liana, her maid, her nurse, Anya, took one look at her hollowed-out, devastated face. The dust of sunstone and grief ground into her skin and wordlessly drew her a bath, helping her wash away the physical remnants of the past. The woman's kindness, her silent, knowing tears, were almost too much to bear. They were a reminder of the only love that had ever been real and safe, now also a casualty. For 3 days, a pall of dread and speculation hung over the palace, thick as fog. The court buzzed with theories, but fear of the king's black, thunderous mood kept them at a wary distance. Lady Isolde watched from the shadows of colonnades and behind fans, her eyes alight with triumphant, avid curiosity. She knew something monumental had fractured, and she was waiting, a vulture, to see how the pieces would fall, to see what carcass she could pick over. On the 4th day, a stone-faced page brought a formal summons. The king requested her presence in the small council chamber. Not their private rooms, not the sunroom. The council chamber. Her fate was to be official, judicial, a matter of state. She dressed in the simplest gown she had, the original gray one she had arrived in, now cleaned but feeling like a shroud. She walked into the chamber with her head high, the posture of her bloodline, though her heart was a ruin. Darius sat at the head of the long, polished table, Rylan standing at his right hand like a sentinel of judgment. Both men looked as if they had not slept, haunted by the same ghosts. Darius did not ask her to sit. His silver eyes, when they finally met hers, were haunted, devastated, but the kingly mask was back in place, hardened by pain into something cold and implacable. "Lyra, of the dawning sun," he began, his voice formal, devoid of all the warmth, the awe, the love she had come to crave and fear. It was the voice of a judge reading a sentence. "You have committed a treason of the highest order against the crown of Moonstone, deception of the sovereign, conspiracy to infiltrate the royal house. By all the ancient laws of this land, by the precedents set by my own ancestors, your life is forfeit. It is the price for such a lie." Lyra said nothing. She had expected this. She had prepared for it, had seen the executioner's block in her dreams for years. A part of her welcomed an end to the pain.
Ryland's jaw was clenched so tight a muscle twitched in his cheek. He believed the words, the law, but she could see the conflict in his eyes, the memory of the sobbing boy king in the ruins warring with the loyal soldier. Darius stood, placing his hands flat on the table, leaning forward, his presence dominating the room. "But I am not my father." The words were a low, powerful vow, a renunciation. "I will not add your blood to the ocean of it that already lies between our houses. I will not kill the woman the moon goddess, in her infinite and cruel wisdom, saw fit to bind to my soul, no matter the reason. I will not commit the same sin he did." He paused, the silence stretching taut. "But I cannot have a queen whose every breath is a lie. I cannot have a Luna who looks at me and sees only her family's murderer, who wears a crown built on the grave of her ancestors. I cannot build a future on a foundation of such profound, personal betrayal." Lyra's heart, which had been a numb, cold stone, gave a single painful throb of understanding. This was it, the end of the dream. "Therefore," he declared, his voice final, leaving no room for appeal, "the bond, as a public covenant, is broken. The betrothal is dissolved. You will no longer be known as Luna in this court or in this kingdom." This was it. Exile, the dungeons, or a quiet, discreet blade in the dark. "You will remain in the palace," he continued, his gaze unwavering, seeing not the woman but the political problem. "As a political prisoner of the crown. You are a symbol, Lyra, a symbol of a past I am now duty-bound, by my own conscience and by the truth you have forced into the light, to reconcile."
Your existence is a truth this kingdom can no longer afford to ignore, to bury. You are a living testament to what was lost, and you will remain here, under my protection, until I can determine how to move forward from the wreckage of our history. It was not the executioner's block, but it was a different kind of death, more exquisite in its cruelty. To be so close to him, to feel the bond screaming in her veins, a living, painful thing, and to be nothing to him but a prisoner, a symbol, a living, breathing reminder of his guilt and his father's crime. It was a punishment crafted with a poet's sense of irony, a king's strategic mercy that felt like a life sentence in hell. She bowed her head, accepting her sentence, the princess acknowledging the king's authority, even in her own defeat. "As you command, your majesty." The title was a wall between them now, higher and more impenetrable than any castle wall, built from the stones of sunstone. He gave a sharp, final nod, the matter closed. As she turned to leave, escorted by two of Ryland's most trusted, expressionless guards, his voice stopped her at the door, a crack in the cold facade. "Your maid, Anya. She was your nurse, wasn't she? The one who saved you, the one who kept the secret?" Lyra froze, then nodded without turning around, a tight jerk of her head. "She will be reassigned to the Eastern Wing. You will have a new attendant, one chosen by the captain of the guard." It was the final, brutal cut, severing her from her last tether to her old life, to the one person who knew who she truly was, who loved her as Lyra. He was isolating her completely, making her utterly, terribly alone in the gilded cage of his mercy. As the guards led her away to her new, heavily guarded chambers in a secluded tower, she caught a fleeting glimpse of Isolde at the far end of the corridor. The noblewoman's face was a perfect painting of shocked sympathy, but her eyes shone with a voracious, insatiable glee. The king's chosen Luna was gone, dethroned,
disgraced, revealed as an enemy. The field was clear. The game, in her mind, was won. But as the heavy lock clicked shut on Lyra's new door, sealing her into her beautiful, lonely prison, she knew one thing with a certainty that cut through the despair. The game was not over. It had simply changed into something far more dangerous, far more unpredictable. Darius had spared her life, but in doing so, he had unleashed a power he did not yet understand, a consequence he could not control. He had made the ghost of the dawning sun an official, acknowledged guest in his court. He had given the past a voice, a room, a presence. And ghosts, she knew, as she looked out the tower window at the kingdom spread below, were notoriously difficult to keep locked away. The truth was free. It was no longer a secret in her heart, but a fact in the world. And a fact once acknowledged has a power of its own. It was only just beginning to fight back, and its first battlefield would be the heart of the king who had tried to bury it, and the soul of the princess who was its living, breathing embodiment. The story was not ending. It was beginning again on a foundation of ruins and truth.